the Western fantasy journey that began with Game of Thrones. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 101, The Trial of the Seven Sons. Judging from the current situation, it is hard to believe that Renly's plan is correct, because since he started to contact her, the little nun's habit of stealing has not only not improved, but has become more serious. The only difference is that she would share the stolen things with Renly every time. Rhea has already regarded him as a friend and knows how to share, which is a good thing. But the fact that the things she shared were stolen goods made him feel quite subtle. However, Renly did not verbally blame her, because the other party could not understand what he meant. Even if he scolded her, she would not know anything, let alone beating her. From childhood to adulthood, this girl has probably been beaten dozens of times more than ordinary children. But despite this, there must be a statement. So during this period, every time she stole something, Renly would drag this little girl to the original owner to return the item and apologize. Sometimes, if he really couldn't find the original owner, he would hand it over to an old nun who had a high prestige among the nuns, and then let her help deal with it. He believed that in this way, Rhea would understand the meaning of doing this sooner or later. At the same time, he did not think that such a proactive approach would bring any trouble, because Rhea's long-standing bad reputation would make others suspicious and even accustomed to it, even if he did not do so. Or if she had not been inexplicably taken care of in the church, she would have been driven out long ago. Now that she has not been driven out, it is insignificant to add more bad reputation. This behavior actually made the nuns feel quite strange. Sir Lemon is a good man. What's the use of being a good man? Rhea is hopeless. Since Rhea can listen to him, it is always a good thing, and we can save a lot of trouble. I hope the gods will bless him. The nuns who live here are all older. Most of them are fed up with the dumb nun who can't be driven away and can't be educated. Now that there is someone to discipline her and it really works, they are naturally happy to see it. It's just that there are good discussions here, but there are also bad ones. The clergy are abstinent and quite sensitive about this. Now that a warrior's son is always mixed with a nun, it is hard not to cause criticism. This kind of discussion has never stopped, and even spread more and more widely. So when Renly was in the middle of training one day, he was called by Knight Murray to have a talk, or to explain his actions. The place for the talk was a conference room. In addition to Knight Murray, there were also Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the Warrior's Sons, the training officer Knight Owen, several deputy leaders Renly didn't know, and a bald man dressed as a monk. Someone told us that you have been close to a nun in the temple recently? The black-haired leader Nancy had a rather ordinary round face and two thick eyebrows. When he frowned, he looked extremely fierce. However, thinking about the scene when he first met him, Renly found it difficult to think that he was a serious person. Sister Rhea, he admitted frankly, I'm teaching her to read. Read? This statement seemed to make the people present a little stunned. They looked at each other in disbelief. Excuse me, sir, I don't think a girl who has been deaf and dumb since childhood can learn to read, the bald monk said. He seemed to be from the temple, not a member of the Warrior's Sons. Have you tried it? Renly asked. Of course not. How do you know it's impossible without trying? Any normal person can understand why she can't, sir. I don't think I need to explain it. The monk shook his head. I thought so at first, but it turns out that this perception is wrong. Renly answered seriously, she can understand words. I don't know why, but she can understand it. Then why did you teach her to read, or why did you contact a nun? A strange deputy commander asked coldly, as if he was quite displeased with such a trouble in the Knights Templar. A strong knight approaching a weak nun will cause bad talk in the sept, and the impact is not very positive. It's just the prejudice of mortals. Renly had thought about how to deal with it before coming, so he immediately replied, when he heard it, a sage said it well, seeing white arms makes you think of nakedness, and seeing nakedness makes you think of going to bed. This saying is not quite applicable here, but the meaning is almost the same. They think there is an affair when they see us walking together, but in fact, things are not that complicated at all. It's just that their dirty minds instinctively think of dirty things. Yes, it's instinct. Excuse me, my lords, this kind of people are probably not very pious. This made the bald monk cough dryly, and the others looked at each other, acting unnaturally. Only Knight Murray still had a blank expression on his face. So what is the truth? He asked. The truth is redemption. Renly replied, a person who cannot listen or speak since childhood, and does not understand any reason, except eating and drinking instinctively, is like a beast, but she is a person. If a person has fallen to the level of a beast, does he not need redemption? Our nuns will naturally teach him. The monk replied. Your nuns can do nothing but slap her in the face. There are many people suffering in the world, and compared to them, she is nothing. Of course, but she is a nun living in the temple. Renly said loudly, we preach that the gods save the world, but in the end, there is still one person in the temple, under the eyes of the gods in heaven who has not been redeemed. Isn't this a mistake? Don't we need to make up for it? This made the people in the conference room look at each other, and no one spoke. Renly saw that he had said everything he should say, so he said the last sentence. This is my purpose. Although I will be questioned, I will continue to do so. If you think my starting point is suspicious, I will accept supervision at any time. He closed his mouth and the place fell into a silent atmosphere. But after a while, Knight Murray raised his hand to signal him, so Renly bowed and left, leaving these people to discuss inside. There was a door behind him, and the sound seemed quite weak. Because someone was guarding the door, Renly had no chance to stay and eavesdrop, so he could only step away, and he felt helpless about it. All the above words were just his sophistry. He didn't think his real purpose was so noble, and he even suspected that he was taking advantage of the feelings of a little girl, but no matter what, he thought this behavior was good, so although he felt awkward sometimes, he still decided to continue. It's just that I had been thinking about the task itself before, but I didn't expect that there would be trouble in such a trivial matter. But after thinking about it, Renly didn't care much, but turned and walked out of the hill, preparing to get the mint he needed today. Thank you to the book friend Lenengzi for the 500 reward, and thank you to the book friends Huaxizize, Tewu Zenran, I'm Yunion and the book friends Wozu Mayanan for the 100 reward. Chapter 102 The Trial of the Seven Sons. We accept your explanation. No one will bother you for this matter again. On the evening of the interview, Knight Murray came to inform him of this matter. In the hut, Renly signaled his servant Egg to pour a cup of mint tea for the guest, and asked at the same time, will there be anyone to supervise? The other party smiled faintly. Who will admit that their thoughts are dirty? Renly nodded, but Knight Murray restrained his smile and said, your behavior is good, but you must be careful to avoid suspicion. It is not something that you can avoid trouble just because you are right. At the same time, your words are still too radical. Some people are very dissatisfied with you. Telling the truth always hurts people. Renly shrugged and then asked, what are the consequences of this dissatisfaction? You may be sent to patrol the city, and the training will be temporarily terminated. Knight Murray said, I think you still need to continue training. After all, we are not short of manpower at present, but it is also good to start carrying out missions. This is another kind of experience. As he said, he patted the blonde knight's shoulder, as if to comfort him. Renly didn't feel anything wrong. This is quite normal. It is about equipping horses and distributing armor. The church cannot keep him like a noble lord and do nothing. Even if this is not the case, he will stop training soon. It's just that it may be a little earlier now. After a few words of advice, Knight Murray stepped away. After seeing him off, Renly fell into deep thought. It can be said that the gender gap in this world is not that serious. In fact, although this place is very similar to the Middle Ages in memory, the attitude towards women is much more relaxed. There is no saying that women are born filthy and sinful. Apart from anything else, the gods worshipped by the seven gods church have 7 faces in one body, including 3 male images and 3 female images, and one who is neither male nor female. It can't be more balanced. So the result of this matter is actually within his expectations. But the impact it brings makes Renly quite troublesome. Training all day is actually very boring, but compared with patrolling without any results, Renly is obviously more enthusiastic about training. After all, he is not a native here, so he doesn't need to brush up his qualifications. It's just that, if you want to solve this matter, it is not without a way. Thinking about it, Renly looked at his armor hanging on the wall unconsciously. The final result of this matter was also inconclusive, because Renly contributed the armor accessory of the lance stand. This thing is very effective. After the experiment, the difference in power between the charge with the lance stand and the gun ring in the ordinary charge is very obvious. As soon as he showed it, he quickly attracted the attention of Knight Murray, who was listening to him, and then quickly received the attention of the senior leaders of the knights. There are countless knights in Westeros, and the Sons of Warriors are just some of the more special ones. The reason for their specialness is their identity, rather than their ability. In fact, despite their reputation, there are not many top knights among the Sons of Warriors. After all, the life of this kind of church knight is generally hard and restricted. Apart from some impoverished civilian knights, most knights come from aristocratic families and would not consider joining in to suffer under normal circumstances. It's just that, if there is this special accessory, the ability of the Knights of the Sons of Warriors will instantly rise to a higher level. Although this improvement is limited to lance charge, the influence brought by it is definitely more than that. The name Lemon has been mentioned repeatedly during this period, but compared with the previous things, this mention is much more positive. Therefore, it actually brings a lot of benefits. At least he is no longer an unknown person now, and he finally has one more bargaining chip to join the future Seven Sons trial. Of course, if only considering this point, Renly will not hand it over so easily. He has no choice but to make such a decision. First of all, his armor is obviously different from others. Although the accessory is not very eye-catching, as long as he wears it out, it can still be discovered by someone with a heart. Once it comes, it will inevitably be exposed. Secondly, although the blacksmith made a solemn promise, Renly would not trust a stranger so easily. In other words, even if the other party kept it secret, what about others? There is more than one blacksmith in a blacksmith shop. Finally, Renly did not need to keep it secret. His mission is to join the trial team, and also to ensure the final victory of the trial. This kind of guarantee is obviously impossible to achieve by his own power. Reality is not so fantastic, and there is no magic pill to upgrade his combat power immediately. Facing a group of highly skilled tin cans, he really can't raise the slightest sense of superiority. In the end, it still depends on the power of the group. History has changed, but the original historical records can also be used as a reference. In the original history, it was the Targaryen side that won in the end, not the church. So he had no reason to keep the lance rack secret. The only thing worth worrying about is whether this thing will be spread out and used by the enemy, but Renly doesn't think that the church will allow this to happen at this juncture. The natives can't predict the possible judgment in the future, but they must keep it strictly confidential. After all, this is a big killer. If it doesn't work before it is exposed, it will be a shame to the gods. Of course, if there is a traitor who leaks it, that's another story, but considering this is like considering whether you will have diarrhea on the day of the judgment. It can't be said to be worrying about nothing, but it is indeed cowardly. The days returned to their usual pace, but for some reason, the explanation he gave to the high-ranking officials that day gradually spread. Some people admired him, while others agreed with him on the surface, but secretly disagreed. But none of this affected Renly. After days of training, he had mastered the lance to level 4 after arriving at King's Landing. His swordsmanship level had not improved, but his shield use had also reached level 4. Although this level was far behind that of a senior knight, it was not much worse than that of a young new knight. Although he was not qualified for the trial, Renly was already very satisfied with it. It was just a pity that he looked not much different from a knight, and what he had learned was basically the same. So why didn't he awaken the knight profession? After all, in his understanding, the bard profession was just a mixture of some musical instruments and singing skills, and there was nothing strange about it except for the derived characteristics. It stands to reason that knights should be like this. Is there any connection that I didn't think of? Renly thought. Or is it that professions cannot be acquired through active learning? In addition, his task of guiding the Son of Chaos was initially effective. For example, although Rhea's habit of stealing had not improved, when Renly dragged her to apologize, she would also follow Renly's example and bow, which surprised the nuns. Then their impression of him changed, and they also looked at Renly, the son of a warrior who volunteered. Of course, Renly felt that Rhea didn't know what she was doing when she did this. It was probably just a simple imitation. Anyway, she looked quite confused. But again, this is a good start. Renly believed that, if she continued like this, she would understand what is good and evil sooner or later. Unfortunately, things rarely seem to go smoothly. In the plain and fulfilling busyness, time passed quickly. 10 days passed in a flash, since Renly took back the armor that day. On the afternoon of the 10th day, he went to the Fisherman's Square in King's Landing with caution to keep the appointment. Originally, Renly was still wary of the possibility of a trap in this agreement, but he met the king's good of his family smoothly. Unfortunately, the other party did not bring the dragon egg, but brought bad news instead. Dragonstone is now controlled by Queen Visenya, and I can't get close to his majesty. The middle-aged man with a beard, still wearing a black cloak, said seriously, and his majesty's condition has worsened, and he is almost dying. This made Renly stunned. Although he had some guesses about the possibility of the king's illness, he had not obtained any accurate information about it before. Now he directly heard that King Enes's condition had worsened. Not only was it so abrupt, but the time was also much earlier than he remembered. This alone did not affect anything, but the consequences of this incident were very obvious. After King Enes's death, there must be a new king to succeed to the throne, and this successor was Maegor Targaryen in the original history. Maegor would come directly to King's Landing after he succeeded to the throne, and then the trial would take place. This was the original course of history, and if things continued along this path, it would simply mean that Renly would not have much time left. Chapter 103 The Trial of the Seven Sons. King's Good Renly Baratheon obviously didn't realize what kind of changes would happen. He told Renly the news, just to inform him not to do anything like killing the hostage. After that, he was ready to leave. However, Renly suddenly stopped him and asked slowly under the other party's vigilant gaze, "What do you think is the reason why Queen Visenya did this?" The Queen Mother hopes that her son Maegor will inherit the Iron Throne instead of Prince Aegon. Although he felt that Renly was an enemy rather than a friend, Renly Baratheon still answered, "She has always hoped that Prince Maegor can be named the Prince of Dragonstone, but his majesty did not do as she wished, so their relationship became very strained. It seemed that there was no need to keep this matter secret, so although he was a royal guard, he had no concerns about talking about this." "Then what do you think are the chances of her success?" "She won't succeed," the King's Good said without hesitation. "Prince Aegon is his majesty's legitimate heir, not Maegor. Your Prince Aegon is currently trapped in the Riverlands by the people of the church." Renly reminded, by the time he learns the news, it may be too late. In history, the Prince Aegon was also besieged during his post-wedding tour, but the place where he was trapped was in the Westerlands instead of the Riverlands. Obviously, this matter had gone wrong for some reason. When thinking of this, Renly subconsciously flashed through his mind the attack he encountered in the Riverlands, but he didn't think much about it because the conversation was still going on. "That's why I'm going to inform His Royal Highness," Renly Baratheon said, frowning, and asked, "What's your purpose in telling me this?" Renly didn't answer his question directly, but asked irrelevantly, "What do you think is the most direct way to resolve the conflict with the church?" "Burn them all to death with dragon fire." Such straightforward words made Renly speechless for a while, and then he quickly said, "Don't you know what happened in Dawn? Dragon fire can certainly make some people surrender, but it will also make more people rebellious." The other party was silent after hearing this. Renly said, "It seems very impressive that Aegon the Conqueror used 3 dragons to establish the huge Targaryen dynasty, but few people noticed that after the establishment of the dynasty, Aegon spent his entire life patrolling around with dragons and intimidating local lords, and finally consolidated this new kingdom. Even so, there are still people in Westeros who miss the era when the 7 kingdoms coexisted. Now that you use dragon fire to stimulate them, it will only sow the seeds of division. Don't you know that it is easy to avoid overt means, but it is difficult to guard against cold arrows in the dark?" Then what do you think is the solution to the problem of the church, sir? Asked the bearded middle-aged man under the cloak. He could tell that Renly had other purposes, but he was also very interested in this question. Trial by combat, Renly replied. No matter how great your sins are, or how unreasonable they are, a trial by combat is enough to clear you of any wrongdoing. The church preaches that the power of the gods will be involved in the trial, and that the gods will only allow the righteous side to win. In fact, this is ridiculous, but everyone thinks so. So let me ask you, if you win in a trial by combat, can the church go against the verdict of the gods? So you think your highness should use a trial by combat to get rid of the siege of the church? These words stunned Renly, and then he felt that the mind of this blood ancestor was really a bit rigid. He might think of using this, or you might go and inform him to do so, but it would be too late, and the church might not accept it. Renly shook his head and said, the twins are a long way from King's Landing. By the time you get there, Queen Visenya would have crowned Meager long ago. The other party retorted, that's impossible. His Highness Egan is the true heir to the Iron Throne. Meager crowned himself without authorization, and no lord would obey him. Meager is the son of Egan the Conqueror, and the Egan you are talking about is just his grandson, Renly replied. And King Enos is weak and incompetent, so it's hard to guarantee that his offspring will have a strong character. Meager is the opposite. Who do you think the lords who are fed up with the rule of a weak king want to inherit the Iron Throne? In other words, do the lords who miss the old times want to honestly submit to the legitimate king, or join the other side and let the Targaryen family fight each other? Renly had no evidence to support his words, and there was no relevant record in history books, but he brought it up at this time to fool the other party, and he didn't care whether there was evidence or not, as long as it sounded like that. The Iron Throne is not for whoever they want to sit on it. The King's Guard answered, but the tone was different from the beginning. What else? Can you sit on the Iron Throne, based on those illusory principles and rules? As a family member of the usurper, Renly had a say in this, but he didn't explain it in detail, but changed the subject. When His Majesty Enos died of illness, it was very likely that Meager would sit on the Iron Throne, but the biggest problem he faced was not the succession order you mentioned, but the church. After all, Meager had bigamy first, and his first wife was the niece of the archbishop. The church was actually the most hostile to him. He said, so let's go back to the topic just now. How can we solve the troubles brought by the church? Or in other words, how can we make the church temporarily lay down its arms and not immediately resist the new king? Trial by combat? Yes, Meager will definitely do so, and even if he can't think of it, Queen Visenya should think of using the trial to publicize the legitimacy of her son's succession to the Iron Throne and temporarily appease the church. The other party didn't say anything after hearing this, nor did he refute anything, but fell into deep thought. Obviously, he actually had some guesses about the future situation of Meager inheriting the throne, but he was never willing to admit it in his heart. The light of dusk gradually converged, and the two people in a small alley on the side of the Fisherman's Square in King's Landing stood face to face. One bowed his head in thought, and the other waited quietly. Soon after, the bearded Baratheon looked up at Renly. What is your purpose in saying this? As a member of the King's Guard, you have a special status. I suggest you find someone to inform the Prince Egan you mentioned, and you stay in King's Landing. Renly said, when Meager is crowned, and challenges those who oppose his rule, you must stand up against him in the name of Prince Egan. Why? Of course, it is for Prince Egan's throne. If it really develops as you speculate, why don't I wait until Meager and the church fight each other? What do you have to do with it? If Meager wins the trial, it means that his succession has been legalized. If he loses, do you think that as the victorious party, those people in the church, will honestly negotiate with your Prince Egan? The other party didn't say anything. Renly said, wait for Meager's party to challenge, then you will accept the challenge, so that Meager will have no room to refuse, and if you win this trial, it will be equivalent to solving the division of the royal family, and the church will more or less acknowledge the impact of the trial. If you win, and Meager's party refuses to execute, it will be equivalent to ignoring the judgment of the gods. In this way, you will have the opportunity to win over the church to Prince Egan's side, which is a good thing anyway. It sounds like that The other party nodded after hearing this, and then said frankly, "Unfortunately, there is a high possibility that I will fail." Renly smiled at this, and then revealed his true purpose. "So you must request the Seven Sons trial. Thank you for the 100 reward from Yunianaya, Yanzinayu and 201709271516142550. Chapter 104 The Trial of the Seven Sons. The trial of the Seven Sons is similar to a normal trial by combat, but the two parties involved are now 7 against 7. Relatively speaking, individual strength is not so important. This kind of trial is sacred and cannot be easily rejected, but it is not only the church that can propose it. Everyone can make such a request when facing accusations or making accusations, and then organize people to fight against the other party. Of course, this does not include civilians. Renly Baratheon of the King's Good was hesitant about this. After hearing this, he did not make a decision immediately, but prepared to go back to the hotel where he was staying to think about it. Renly did not force it, or it was useless to force it. If there was really another year, then he would have a lot of room for operation, but now things have become very sudden, so he can only use the alternative plan, from passive to active. In the church, Renly is just a talented new knight. Although he has contributed a very important invention, it has nothing to do with his own combat effectiveness. On the side of Renly Baratheon of the King's Good, although Renly cannot be regarded as the only ally of the other party, he is also a point that can be used. Then if the applicant for the trial of the Seven Sons was changed from the church to this King's Good, his chances of joining would be much greater, or in other words, Renly was sure that he would join from him. But this method was not actually reliable, because if he left the church and went out to go it alone, it was hard to say whether he would agree with the mission goal. The mission was to participate in the trial of the Seven Sons of Megarai in the name of a warrior's son and win. Renly was indeed a warrior's son now, but if the trial was not initiated by the church, would it be considered completed even if he won? So he had never thought of this before, but now he had no choice but to do it. But if the church also joined in? He kept thinking about this question along the way, and he had unknowingly walked into the range of the September. In the dim night, stepping onto the square at the top of Rena's Hill, the absent-minded Renly suddenly heard a chaotic sound of footsteps. He turned his head, and happened to find a thin figure falling to the ground with a plop. However, under Renly's gaze, she stood up without hesitation, and continued to run towards him. Her long black hair was spread out, and she was wearing a white robe. She looked like a demon. But when she came closer, her face looked quite friendly. This person was naturally the mute nun, and Renly recognized her at first sight. Her nose was a little red, and there was a bloody scar on her forehead from scratches. Now it was slowly bleeding, but her face was full of smiles. After approaching, she pulled up the corner of Renly's clothes with one hand, and handed him a mint leaf with the other hand. She seemed to be smiling, but her eyes seemed a little nervous when she handed the mint leaf, as if she was afraid that Renly would not accept it. This look made Renly a little dazed, and then he vaguely understood something. Usually he would teach her to read in the evening, but today the conversation lasted a little long, and it was already past the normal time. This person might be a little impatient, so he reached out to take the mint leaf and put it in his mouth, while raising his hand to rub the other's hair, so that Rhea's already messy long hair became even more messy. However, the little nun did not express dissatisfaction because of this. The smiling mouth on the face, covered by the messy long hair, opened wider, as if flattering. This expression was completely different from the initial look of running away due to stimulation, but it made Renly feel uncomfortable. You should learn to get used to my absence, because sooner or later you will have to live alone. Muttering, he motioned Rhea to sit on a nearby bench, and he took out the handkerchief and a box of brown red ointment he carried with him, and began to treat the wound on her forehead. The ointment is called Fire, produced in Me, the capital of crafts in the free trade city-state. The effect is to burn, clean and disinfect wounds. Because there will be bumps and bruises during training, Renly always carries this kind of thing with him, and now it is just right to use it. The other party was very honest now, sitting there obediently, allowing Renly to apply this hot medicinal oil on her forehead. Although her little head moved a little, she kept a good sitting posture with her legs together and her hands covering each other on her lower abdomen. This was the sitting posture that Renly taught her many times, so that Rhea would not touch other people's things when she was sitting. Now she looks quite similar. At first glance, the whole person looks like a little lady, and Renly is quite relieved about this. But before I leave, I will find a reliable nun to take care of you. By then, you should be able to communicate with people in simple words. No, I should have settled you before the trial, otherwise it would be terrible if I died and went back, and I couldn't let you stay here any longer. Meager is a madman. He won the trial and still used dragons to kill people. He deserved his death later. He muttered while applying the medicine, as if he was explaining his funeral. Rhea looked at him blankly, unable to understand. Renly shook his head at this. After applying the medicinal oil, he did not leave. Instead, he sat on the chair next to the girl and leaned back in deep thought. One of them felt lost and did not want to talk, while the other looked at the other curiously, but could not speak. The atmosphere was quite peaceful for a while. The cathedral building at night was like a domed monster. The closed door was like the monster's eyes. It did not move during its rest, as if it had been dead for a long time. Only the sound of insects chirping around and the sound of running water from the fountain statue in the center of the square were heard, bringing a hypnotic power. It was midsummer and the weather was not cold. As he thought about it, he became a little confused, and Renly fell asleep in a daze. He had a bizarre dream. In the dream, he turned into a powerful knight and killed all the enemies in the arena. Finally, he awakened the ability of telepathic communication and became a master of language. But the environment of the dream changed immediately. He seemed to become a mute and then ran to be a teacher. After gesturing for a long time, a group of elementary school students in school uniforms below still couldn't understand. He was a little angry and suddenly thought of using a mobile phone. However, when he took it out of his pocket, the dream disappeared instantly. The hazy mind revived and everything in the dream passed away quickly. In the end, only a trace of afterglow remained in his heart, but it became more and more blurred. He opened his eyes and saw a ray of light blooming in the sky, proving that a new day had arrived. The surroundings were quite quiet. Renly, who had regained his mind, thought of something, so he turned his head and found that Rhea had not left. Now she was sitting on a chair, with her hands folded, and her head bowed in prayer, looking very quiet. Renly had noticed this habit of Rhea since the beginning, before they really came into contact. He didn't take it seriously. It was just that he was extra patient after waking up, or he didn't want to think about anything serious, so he observed her a few more times, and a discovery made him suddenly startled. Because he suddenly realized that normal nuns would only pray in front of the corresponding statues or representatives of the 7 gods, but the direction the girl in front of him was facing was the male sculpture in the center of the square. Renly was puzzled by this, so when the other party finished praying and looked over, he raised his hand and pointed at the statue and then drew a question mark on the ground. This behavior represents asking what this is. In the past, Renly taught this to let the other party ask questions when facing unfamiliar things, and then he would answer them with a behavior. Now it was used on Rhea in reverse, and she could understand it. So she picked up a branch and squatted on the ground, as if she was ready to write, but after hesitating for a long time, she didn't write a word, and finally looked up at Renly, her eyes full of trouble and confusion. Renly understood that she didn't know how to express herself again, or she hadn't learned the corresponding expression vocabulary. He was a little disappointed, but he didn't care much. However, the other party did not give up. After sitting back in the chair, she pulled Renly's sleeve and looked at him. She mumbled for a long time and finally uttered a syllable. Rhea couldn't speak, only because she couldn't hear the sound, not because she couldn't speak. In the past, she often made various inexplicable words. Some sounded like some random babbling, and some were vague, and seemed to match the common language. Renly guessed that it might be that Rhea imitated the mouth movements of others when they spoke. Usually, this kind of imitation is usually difficult to recognize, but today it sounds different. Compared with the usual fuzziness, it can't be said to be extremely clear, but it can be understood. Because of this, Renly was a little stunned. Because this syllable means father in the common language. Chapter 105 The Trial of the Seven Sons. The light of dawn radiated slowly from the sky, and monks gradually appeared in the deserted square. They were either walking or talking to each other. The scene looked vigorous. The towering statue in the center of the square was half covered by the morning light, and seemed to be emitting brilliant colors, which also looked quite sacred. However, the atmosphere on the benches at the edge of the square was a little subtle. As if she was afraid that Renly didn't understand what she was saying, Rhea said this word several times in a row, and then looked at him expectantly, as if she hoped that Renly could understand what she meant. In response, Renly stared at the young face in front of him for a long time, and finally patted the other's forehead with a smile, thinking that this must be a nun who taught her when she was a child. After all, many people would not directly say that they didn't know who her parents were when talking to a child. There would always be a proper explanation, such as picking them up from a dung heap, or kidnapping them on the street. And it seems understandable to put the pot on the statue. That depends on the existence of the temple. Feeling the gentle touch on her head, Rhea thought that Renly understood, so she sighed lightly, and then a friendly smile bloomed on her face. At this time, a ray of morning light just covered the other's tender face. The smiling face under the messy black hair made Renly's movements suddenly stagnate. He felt a sense of deja vu, so he hurriedly reached out to pull away the long hair that covered Rhea's face, and began to look at her carefully. She still looked the same, with a snub nose, round face, and a few freckles on her cheeks. Because of Renly's teaching, she would wash her face and brush her teeth every day, so her face looked clean and her teeth were brushed white and shiny. At this time, a blush gradually appeared on her cheeks, as if she was a little embarrassed to be looked at. But she did not resist or express dissatisfaction, but showed a hint of curiosity. Her big golden eyes blinked at the big blonde in front of her, obviously puzzled by Renly's behavior at this time. Renly also felt puzzled. He didn't know if it was a psychological effect, but he suddenly found that the girl's face seemed to be somewhat similar to his previous identity, except that her skin was white instead of brown, and her eyes were of an unusual color. Impossible. I didn't do anything. How could I leave offspring? And the age doesn't match. He murmured to himself, but couldn't help frowning, so that the girl who was originally tilting her head to look at him lied in her heart, and she might think that she accidentally made Renly angry again. So she raised her fingers to smooth her eyebrows. The speed of this little hand rushed over was so fast that Renly almost got poked in the eye by her, and at the same time, he was quite surprised by his face being moved around, so he quickly raised his hand to grab the other's arm to signal to stop. As a result, Rhea might think that Renly was expressing dissatisfaction, so she hurriedly took out a small lionkin from the sleeve pocket of her nun's robe with her other hand, and handed it to him. She hesitated anxiously for a while, and her eyes became more and more moist, as if she was about to cry. This jar had always been used to hold bugs. Normally, Rhea treasured it very much, and would never throw it away, even if she was asked to. But now, she gave it to him without hesitation. Renly felt mixed emotions, but knew that he couldn't go on like this, so he didn't take the jar. He raised his hand and touched her head to comfort her, and smiled at the same time, indicating that he was not angry. Rhea didn't seem to believe it. She kept stuffing the jar into Renly's arms, as if she would not give up until he took it. Renly had no choice but to accept it, and she burst into tears and laughed. Then, when Renly wasn't paying attention, she took another cautious look at the jar, as if she was reluctant to give it up. But when Renly turned his eyes back, Rhea blinked and smiled at him again. She seemed to think that it was okay for Renly to accept her precious jar, so although Renly seemed a little silent when he asked her to go back to her residence to rest, Rhea still followed him with a smile, and even pestered Renly to write several new words for her when they were in their own room. She seemed very eager to learn. Finally, when Renly left and could no longer be seen, she reluctantly withdrew her gaze from behind the window, and then went back to bed and hugged her washed khaki bedding and fell asleep peacefully. But Rhea could relax, but Renly could not. He was still thinking about the syllable he heard before. Rationally speaking, he didn't think he would have offspring in this world. After all, he didn't do anything at all, but the more he looked at that face, the more familiar it seemed. Although it had been more than 40 years since he became a Dornishman, that was only counted here. In his memory, it had not actually been a few months, and his impression of this could not be wrong. But this must be a mistake, otherwise there was no explanation. Or is he still alive after he was separated from the object of possession? This doesn't seem right. If he is really alive, then as the one who saved Queen Targaryen, he can't have left no traces other than Renly. Was he killed by the jealous conqueror? Or did he have offspring before I possessed him? On the way back to his residence, various thoughts flashed through his mind, and they all made sense, but deep in his heart there was another idea that he couldn't get rid of. What if this is true? What if Rhea is really his descendant, or her existence is related to himself? After all, the name Son of Chaos could never appear in the original Westeros, but it appeared. Isn't it because I'm also an outsider? If this is true, then what does the Son of Chaos represent? How was she born? Son of Chaos, Son of Chaos. Renly was full of thoughts for a while, and seemed very absent-minded. While walking, his drooping right hand accidentally touched a cold object on the side of his purse. He thought about it, and then pulled it down to check. This is an iron can that can be held in one hand. It is grey in color, and has a black and purple rope tied to it for easy hanging. Its surface has a kind of rusty feeling caused by years of friction. It feels heavy in the hand, as if there are many things in it. This is the can that Rhea gave him before. Usually, she can be seen stuffing worms into it, but she rarely takes worms out of it. Renly had no interest in this before, but now he is curious about the behavior of the mute girl, so he opened the iron can and looked inside in the morning light. Logically, there should be a bunch of bugs or bug corpses inside. Renly was ready to be choked by the stench, but when he looked inside, he found that there was no dirt at all. Instead, there were 3 very delicate semi-concave discs. Under the morning light, they shone with a faint luster, as if they were cast in gold. This looks like an eggshell. Renly thought in a daze, then took out one of the pieces, and looked at it carefully. His eyes narrowed unconsciously, and finally, an idea suddenly emerged. Rhea thought that the statue was her father, but she couldn't have known it by nature. Who told Rhea? Chapter 106 The Trial of the Seven Sons. The life information of the mute girl is very simple, or rather monotonous, and Renly had already found out everything. She was originally an abandoned baby adopted by an old nun of high status. Later, the old nun named Miria died, and Rhea became a child that no one cared about. Year after year, she grew up in this temple, with food and clothing provided by the temple. She could do nothing but make trouble on a daily basis. The only thing the girl could do was wash clothes, which seemed to be taught by the old nun who adopted her. Because of this, the temple management wanted her to be responsible for washing clothes for other nuns to prove her labor value, but later this matter was left unresolved for some obvious reasons. However, another nun named Ada in the temple seemed to have a close relationship with the dead old nun, and Sister Ada was the leader of all the nuns, so even though Rhea did many things that were very excessive, she did not drive her out, but often protected her, and took care of her from time to time. After realizing that there was something wrong with Rhea's background, another question arose that made Renly unable to calm down. So he ignored the fact that it was still early and just walked to the door of his house. He changed direction again and turned to walk to another place. Having lived in this residential area for a long time, he knew some of the celebrities here, so he knew that the nun named Ada should be watering the flowers in the flower bed. Sure enough, when Renly walked along the intricate alleys of the residential area to a small open square surrounded by buildings, he saw the person who was highly respected by the nuns. But when Renly asked the nun who adopted Rhea, the other party's answer was beyond his expectations. I'm not actually familiar with Miriam. She's from the East Continent. The old nun with black and white hair said slowly, while watering the flowers, because she donated a large sum of money to the temple. We all respect her, but she is very withdrawn. Usually, she seldom talks to us, except when she spends time with Rhea. The East Continent is the abbreviation for the continent across the narrow sea. Its official name is Essos, which is the continent where the free trade city-state is located. What does she look like? Renly asked. No hair, half of her face was burned, and the rest is very blurry. It's been too long. The old man who looked to be in his 50s answered slowly, and his skinny fingers touched a red rose that looked delicate and beautiful while speaking. I remember it was very beautiful. Renly frowned when he heard this, and then suddenly asked, if you are not familiar with each other, why do you take care of Rhea so much? They all say you are doing it because of old feelings. Because I have much more patience than ordinary nuns, sir. The other party laughed when he heard this. What you said before is right. We should not ignore the poor people in front of us. What's more, the money left by Sister Miria is enough to redeem many sins of Rhea. As she spoke, she straightened up and looked at the originally messy flower beds with a look of relief. She was made neat and beautiful again. At the same time, she said to Renly, many people have tried to contact Rhea, but to no avail. I don't know how you did it, but since you can change her, sir, I hope you can take care of her more. She is a poor child. Sister Miria was here before. After Miria died, I could give her some care, but who should take care of her after I die? She definitely can't do it herself. She then nags for a while, and Renly listens quietly. When she finally finishes speaking, he bows to the old woman, and then turns away. The other party looks at his back thoughtfully, shakes his head, then takes out a bag of flower seeds from his pocket, and gets busy again. He didn't get much information from Sister Ada, but what he did know made Renly's guess even more serious, so when he returned to the house, he pushed the bald boy who was sleeping on the bed, until he woke up with a grunt. It was still too early, and there was nothing around, except the sound of birds. The boy looked confused after being woken up, and then rubbed his eyes and answered the question Renly had just asked with a little irritation. I said I don't know. What happened to my grandmother? My father may not know, so how can I know? Think about it carefully. Renly squatted beside his bed and asked seriously. I don't know. If you think about it carefully. The boy stiffened his neck and answered, but after the other party narrowed his eyes, he still curled his lips unwillingly, and then pondered for a long time in a daze, and finally squeezed out a sentence. It seems that Grandma had a quarrel with Grandpa before she disappeared. He said hesitantly, it seems that the quarrel was very fierce, and then she left and never came back. Then what? Then I don't know. The boy said, maybe she went back to Dragonston first. Whenever people in our family quarrel, one of them will definitely run back to Dragonston. My grandmother should be no exception. Later, she may have gone to the East Continent. She seems to go to the East Continent often. My father said that she is always interested in it. What about other things? Are there any strange ones? Strange. The boy pondered for a long time, and finally said, she has a dragon egg that can't be hatched, no matter how hard you try. Is this strange? Golden? Maybe, I don't know. As he spoke, the boy suddenly had an idea and thought of some special news, but he hesitated, because it might involve slandering his elders. However, seeing Renly's serious look, the boy still spoke out. When I was a child, my grandfather said that my grandmother might be crazy, and she spent all day studying magic spells that she could never use. My father didn't say so, but he said that my grandmother always liked to think about some things, such as she thought that worldly power didn't matter, and learning magic was the right way, because magic can turn people into anyone, and can also replace anyone. She also always said that her egg was not a dead egg, but an egg full of life, which contained a very powerful dragon. Did the egg hatch later? I don't know. My grandmother took it away. It should not have hatched. Such things can't be concealed, but I haven't heard of an extra dragon appearing anywhere. Renly nodded, and seeing that the boy really couldn't say anything, he patted his forehead and let him rest. The boy egg lost his sleepiness, and seeing that the blonde knight looked absent-minded, he asked curiously, why do you always ask these questions, sir? Do any elders in your family know my grandmother? More or less. Renly replied, stood up and walked towards his bed, saying at the same time, sleep a little longer, and when you wake up, come with me to the cemetery in the cathedral. Cemetery? The boy was stunned when he heard it. What are you going there for? To visit an old friend. Chapter 107 The Trial of the Seven Sons. There are several cemeteries in King's Landing, scattered in all directions. There is also a cemetery dedicated to burying clergy at the top of Rena's Hill, which is located at the innermost of the residential area, not far from their residence. The boy instinctively has a bit of awe for the dead in the cemetery, and is deeply poisoned by various legends and ghost stories, so much so that he was not happy when he was dragged here. But after walking in, his face became solemn, perhaps infected by the atmosphere here, or perhaps he felt that there was nothing scary here, and then he returned to his former steadiness. This cemetery on the hill is blocked by a circle of wooden fences. There are rows of tombstones in the cemetery, most of which are made of granite, with a 7-pointed star logo carved on the top. The grey and simple shape, at first glance, they seem to be exactly the same. However, if you look closely, you can still find different names engraved on the surface of the tombstones, but they look very shallow. This seems to be a custom of the Church of the Seven Gods. The most representative of this custom is the successive archbishops of the church. After they take office as archbishops, they will give up their own names and only address each other as the archbishop, because he has become the spokesperson of the gods. Fortunately, these dead people have not completely given up their own names and become servants of the gods, so Renly was able to find the tombstone of Sister Miria. It was one of the many stone tombstones mixed in. There was nothing special about it, and there was nothing outstanding about it. Because there were often nuns to take care of it, there was no dust or cobwebs on it. The only thing worth mentioning was that there was an old oak tree growing next to this tombstone. The oak tree had lush branches, and several black crows squatted in it. When they saw someone coming below, they were not scared away. Instead, they shouted arrogantly a few times, which seemed very noisy. This also broke the quiet atmosphere in the deserted cemetery. But they stopped calling after a short while, because the two people below did not even look over, which seemed to make the crows lose interest, so they started to comb their feathers on the tree, and their small black eyes kept looking at the two figures, one big and one small, under the tree through the leaves, as if they were thinking of something. Renly ignored all this, or didn't care. At this time, he stood quietly in front of this very ordinary tombstone, his expression a little dazed. The son of chaos, the golden eggshell, the dragon egg from the east continent, with a high status, and a powerful dragon. All the clues came together, although there were still many puzzles, and it was quite incredible, but combined with the situation before he left, he still guessed some things. That is, the old nun who adopted Rhea might be Rhaenyra's, and Rhea was the egg. But that strong and fragile figure at the time, has it turned into a handful of dust in just a few months? Being there, it is hard to notice the flowers withering as time goes by, but when you look back, after leaving this place, you will find that only a short time has passed, and the old friends are gone forever. Renly's mind is empty at this moment. He thinks he may think of many things, but in fact he is not thinking of anything. He stands quietly in front of the tombstone for a long time, not seeing the past, not caring about the future, only the tombstone in front of him, the oak tree beside him, and the quiet atmosphere around him occupy his entire mind. Finally, he put a bunch of white roses in front of the tombstone, then patted the boy's forehead, asked him to follow suit and bowed, and then turned and left. Leaving now? The boy following behind him was very confused. What else? Do you want to live here? I thought the sergeant would talk for a long time. I've seen many people talk a lot when they worship the dead. What can you say to a stone? No one can hear you, even if you say it. Having said this, Renly suddenly paused, then turned around under the boy's strange gaze, and walked back to the tombstone. After a moment of silence, he sang a song called The Beautiful Girl in Summer. This song is a folk song that is widely circulated in Westeros. The melody is cheerful and the rhythm is simple. The beautiful girl in the lyrics is pure and beautiful, but the song sounded from the cemetery, which gave this beauty a layer of sadness. The bald boy beside him listened silently until the last sound faded away. He then asked curiously, "The sergeant can actually sing. Why didn't I notice it before?" Renly looked at him and didn't respond. The news that King Aenys was seriously ill did not hide it from the Seven Kingdoms for long, because he died of illness soon after. It seems that they were prepared for this. King Aenys' brother, Maegor Targaryen, suddenly returned from the exiled free trade city and took advantage of his nephew Aegon being besieged in the Riverlands by the armed forces of the church to be crowned king on Dragonstone, becoming Maegor I. He was the third king to sit on the Iron Throne, and also a king who had obtained the throne illegitimately. A large number of ravens spread from Dragonstone, spreading the news of the new king's coronation throughout the Seven Kingdoms, which made the church very angry. because Meager not only violated the previous punishment and returned from the exile, but also ignored the long-standing inheritance law and claimed the throne without authorization, bypassing his nephew. In addition to the various deeds of that person in the past, everyone in the church was indignant about this and was ready to fight to the death with this king who was more monstrous than Inez. In this atmosphere, the king's good of the family secretly contacted Renly, who was obviously stimulated by the occurrence of this incident. Renly went to discuss with him for a long time, and finally the two parties reached a cooperation. Soon after, things really happened as Renly expected, or as the original historical trajectory would have it. On a gloomy morning, a loud dragon roar suddenly sounded from the coastline, and it became louder and louder. When Meager rode the dragon Balerion, known as the Black Death, to the top of Visenya Hill in King's Landing, thousands of royalists hiding in the city responded to his call and swarmed in. The church took this very seriously, but the other party did not directly conflict with it, but instead made a statement to accept the challenge of anyone who did not submit to his rule. Meager's purpose was easy to guess, but the church was very confident about it. In other words, the Targaryen family was not taken seriously by the church except for the dragon. Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warrior's sons, was ready to fight, but he seemed to be a little drunk from the wine he drank the night before, so he was still confused after waking up, and when he went to fight, someone had already beaten him. The challenger was Renly Baratheon, the king's good of the former King Inez. He openly opposed Meager's coronation as king, believing that it was not legitimate for Meager to have married and to have inherited the Iron Throne over his nephew Aegon, so he challenged him, but demanded a more sacred trial of the seven sons. Meager's side was forced to agree to the challenge, and Renly Baratheon called on many righteous people in King's Landing to join his team. In public, a warrior's son responded to his call, and this warrior's son was called Lemon. It was the middle of the 41st year of the conquest era, and it had been nearly 3 months since Renly entered this historical copy. Thank you Raronoa for the 900 reward. Thank you I'm Neon, Rain of Raw Milk, World Traveler. Water is also called wet. 2017092715161425 an 160,917,124,637,716 for the 100 reward. In addition, it needs to be stated that the author does not like tragedy. Serious face. Chapter 108 The Trial of the Seven Sons. Who allowed you to make a decision without consent? In the meeting room of the Sept, a circle of people sat on both sides of the meeting table and stared at the blonde knight at the door. Everyone looked unhappy and the atmosphere was very tense. It was a familiar scene, but it was different from the small matter of rumors last time. This time the incident was much more serious. Raymond, the king's good, initiated the trial of the seven sons in the afternoon, and he had one night to prepare the staff. The next day, that is, tomorrow, the trial by combat would officially begin. So Renly was facing a difficulty right now. The one who initiated the questioning was Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the Sons of Warriors. He was originally very annoyed because he had made a fool of himself by drinking. Now someone in the Knights Temperance had rashly intervened in the internal fight of the Targaryen royal family without consent. How could he not be angry? You know, they were hostile to all Targaryens, not just one of them. It's the gods in heaven. Renly said something shocking as soon as he opened his mouth. There was no response as people imagined, but this did not affect the anger of some people. The gods in heaven believe that families with incest are monsters, and the gods have never allowed us to stand on the side of monsters. A bald monk answered expressionlessly. Renly thought, why don't you talk to the High Septon who crowned the conqueror? But talking about this now is just a matter of arguing, and it will make the other party angry, so he followed this topic to refute. But the gods require us to uphold justice. He had prepared for this before being summoned, so he talked about the topic non-stop. Meager's succession is lower than his nephew Aegon, and now he hastily crowned himself is not in accordance with the rules. In addition, his mother Visenya used poison and despicable means to kill the previous King Inez. Such a blatant violation of justice, shouldn't they be tried? The latter he mentioned was a rumor that gradually spread in the city. There was no evidence, but it was enough to constitute one of the reasons for trial and accusation. After hearing this, another red-haired knight said, "Of course we need to participate in the trial, but we don't need to join the Targaryens. Standing on the side of the monsters to resist another monster, whoever wins or loses, is contrary to our desired goal, but you rashly got involved. Yes, we can have a second trial after this trial." Another knight said, "The second battle between the church and the Targaryens. Does this mean you are ready to ignore the judgment of the gods?" Renly said, "As we all know, trial by combat is the result decided by the gods, and the trial of the seven sons is more sacred. The reason for the king's goods challenge is bigamy and inheritance. So if Meager wins, should we recognize bigamy and Meager's inheritance rights as legal?" Before these people could speak, Renly said, "Or are some of the things we have been promoting for thousands of years just lip service, and actually it depends on whether it conforms to the interests of the church to be recognized?" This was a bit explicit, and the bold monk subconsciously retorted, when he heard it, "We are servants of the gods, and we only protect the glory of the gods. So in the admonitions of the gods, did what Meager did damage their glory?" Renly asked quickly, "If so, what's wrong with me joining in? Some situations are very special." Lemon Knight Murray, who was sitting quietly on the side, said, "We certainly need to protect the glory of the gods in heaven, but we can't rush into it, and it's really too reckless for you to join in rashly. I don't understand what is so-called recklessness. I only know that Meager is evil and has no right to sit on the Iron Throne, so I will fight him." Renly's voice sounded righteous and stern. On the surface, he looked like a church knight who was really upholding justice, or a fool who didn't know what was good for him. Knight Murray was a little angry because of this. "How can you guarantee that you can defeat Meager after you go up? If the gods really uphold justice, then I will definitely win," Renly said without hesitation, "because victory only belongs to the righteous side. The gods may not look at you, you may still die on the spot, you then let me die in the trial. A true knight should not fear life and death, but should have the faith he must uphold, and that is obviously not compromise." After that, he said directly without waiting for the people at the table to speak again, "My lords, if you think my actions will cause trouble to the church, then I will participate in the trial in the name of Lemon, the illegitimate son of the Osgrey family, instead of the son of a warrior." As he said this, he bowed slightly and saluted, then turned around and left without hesitation, leaving behind a group of church leaders looking at each other in bewilderment. Finally, the red-haired knight said angrily, "Look, this guy is so disregarding the overall situation, and he has no sense of shame. I suggest that he be expelled from the warrior's son directly, so that we will not be dragged down by him." The words behind him could be heard faintly. At this time, there was also a knight guarding the door who looked at him with a complex look after Renly walked out, admiring, surprised, and annoyed. This represents the views of many people on the blonde knight. Renly ignored this. When he stepped away, his face was expressionless all the time, but he was actually thinking about it in his heart. After all, it is unlikely that the church will allow that trial to happen, or it is impossible to allow the trial to be beyond their control. The reason is simple. After countless years of propaganda, the trial by combat basically represents the judgment of the gods. This kind of trial can even ignore secular laws. The one with the bigger fist has the reason. How many evil people use this to wash away their crimes, and it has been tried and tested. The trial of the seven sons is more sacred than a simple trial by combat. So just as Renly said in the room, if the church really allows this trial to happen, then after the result comes out, will they admit it or deny it? The biggest possibility is that the church will go, or be forced to go. You can't let Meager win in public. Renly thought there would be no surprises on this point. He had been thinking about this since he drugged the captain of the warrior's sons, and he was not worried about being expelled from the church, or being expelled before the trial. He announced his participation in the trial in the name of the warrior's sons in public, even in front of the enemy, so the fact that he joined the trial was basically unchangeable. So expelling him from the church at this juncture would be useless, and would only cause criticism. Being called here now was just because the church was too angry. Angry that the King's Good took the lead. Angry that Renly acted without considering the overall situation. And even more angry that he was led by the nose. Knowing this, Renly naturally didn't need to be too polite, because as long as he softened his attitude, a series of questions and reprimands would obviously come flooding in. It would be better to be tough, and then vent his anger. Anyway, he didn't need the identity of the warrior's son after the trial. Of course, all this was risky. Although the plan was well thought out, there was a high possibility that the church would not play by the rules. Before things really happened, no one could guarantee what the specific development would be like. So it might be a mistake and the whole game would be lost. Renly was mentally prepared for this. If the church really did not choose to join this trial, it might directly expel him from the church. Then the question came, is the name of the warrior's son equivalent to the identity of the warrior's son? If others thought he was the warrior's son, did he participate in the trial in the name of the warrior's son? In other words, he did ask to join the trial in the name of the warrior's son, which many onlookers knew at the time, and the news must have spread very quickly. So if he was not the warrior's son in the middle of the trial, did he meet the requirements? If it meets the requirements, that would be great. But if he fails, he can still gain something, because he can understand some mission rules. Of course, it is better not to fail. After all, it is not worthwhile to spend so much time preparing for this mission just to understand the rules. However, the premise of all this is to win, but Renly does not dare to guarantee this. His initial idea is to keep honing his skills and see how far he can go before making a battle plan based on this. Unfortunately, plans cannot keep up with changes. His skills related to knights are obviously not comparable to those of senior masters. Now he can only rely on the lance rack and some non-knight related things. Thinking of this, he has stepped into the residential area, and at this moment, a thin white figure suddenly rushed over from the shadows in the corner. Renly had a headache when he saw this. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109, The Trial of the Seven Sons. Since she stood her up last time, Rhea has become particularly clingy. Every time Renly is late for a while, she will become anxious and even run to his place to find him. Maybe she doesn't have the concept of being late in her mind, but only comes or doesn't come. Renly has complicated feelings about this. Because of his father, he always feels awkward in front of her. He doesn't really think that he is her real father. After all, this person seems to be born from an egg, but he feels that the person in front of him has become a little different in his heart. No longer a simple, but complex task target. However, this did not affect his daily teaching. Although his mood was completely different from the past, his daily performance was no different from before, except that there was a little more melancholy and sadness. It's just that Renly was so busy these 2 days that he couldn't take care of anything else. He had given a lot of instructions, but the other party obviously didn't listen, or didn't understand. This made Renly quite helpless, but facing the aggrieved girl in front of him, he couldn't get angry, and could only choose to comfort her. Lemon went to pick mint. He wrote a sentence on the ground that the girl could understand, and took out a few mint leaves that he carried with him every day, and handed them to her, and was glad that he had started to have this habit of carrying mint leaves with him. Unfortunately, the girl did not take it, but just squatted beside him, staring at him with a little resentment. Seeing this, Renly wrote again, Lemon is training. Because the girl had been to the training ground before, she could understand this word, but after writing this, she still had no reaction. Seeing this, Renly wanted to write the third sentence, but a hand stretched out in front of him, which made him pause in his movements. He looked at the slender arm full of bites, redness, swelling and scratches, and the pile of dead insects squeezed into a ball in her palm. He was stunned for a moment, and then took the gift. The girl raised her hand and rubbed her eyes that were shining with tears, then pulled Renly's sleeve and bumped his arm with her forehead affectionately. Looking at the other person's smiling face, Renly looked a little dazed. For some reason, he suddenly wanted to give up the qualification for the trial that he had been planning for a long time and drag the other party to a quiet place to concentrate on teaching, but he immediately suppressed this inexplicable impulse in his heart. After such a painstaking plan, there were basically no other problems at the moment, except for this last hurdle. How could he just give up? So he stayed there for a while, racked his brains to teach the other party a few new words that she could understand, and wrote goodnight on the ground. The girl nodded reluctantly, and then was sent back to her residence by the golden-haired knight. It was already late at this time, so he immediately returned to his room, and prepared to rest for tomorrow's trial by combat. As a result, as soon as he entered the room, he found that his squire Egg was still asleep, and was now sitting on a small bench in a dull daze. After Renly walked in, he couldn't wait to ask a question. "Sir, are you really going to attend the trial of the Seven tomorrow?" When the news of King Ena's death came, the boy hugged the quilt and cried, but the next day he surprisingly returned to his usual steadiness, but he began to have the habit of being in a daze, and every time he was in a daze, his little face looked full of sadness. "Of course." Renly nodded. "Besides you and Sir Raymond, who else will attend?" Egg asked, with a worried look on his little face. "It's hard to say at the moment," Renly answered while untying his cloak and throwing it on the wooden bed. "But I guess the church should choose to stand on our side. Because you persuaded them? It has nothing to do with me. It's the church's own decision," Renly said, and seeing the other person's dull face, he couldn't help but sigh, so he changed the subject and asked another question. "Who among you Targaryens is on Meager's side?" "On Meager's side?" The boy was stunned, and then answered, "Who else would be on his side except his mother?" "Then on Meager's side, besides being able to ride a dragon, there is only one Visenya. The old woman hasn't been able to ride a dragon for many years. She's too old." The boy didn't use any honorifics when talking about Visenya, and it was obvious that he was hostile. "So only Meager can ride a dragon?" "Yes," the boy answered, and then asked, "Are you afraid that tomorrow's trial will be a fraud?" "I don't think so. If he wants to use a dragon, he won't take the initiative to challenge." Renly nodded, but he was actually thinking about what would happen after the trial. The reason he asked this was naturally because in the original history, the victorious party belonged to Meager, but after the victory, Meager did not give up. After being seriously injured and unconscious for nearly a month, he ignored the effects of the trial and directly rode a dragon to burn the entire Temple of Remembrance to ashes and burn down the 700 warrior sons who were praying in it. This behavior led to a complete explosion of the conflict between the two parties, and the whole of Westeros was in chaos. It was not until the era of Jaehaerys, which was the period of the boy's future rule, that this conflict was completely declared over. The reason why Renly asked this question was naturally because he was afraid that history would still happen as it was after failure, but he was also worried that the enemy would be desperate if he won. But now it seems that the only one who can ride a dragon on the other side is Meager, so as long as they consider killing the other party in the trial, basically that kind of thing will not happen. The boy didn't understand what this guy was thinking at the moment. Seeing that the blonde knight looked thoughtful, he hesitated to speak, but finally couldn't help asking a question. "Can I ask why, sir? This trial has nothing to do with you. Why do you want to get involved?" "For justice," Renly answered smoothly. This may be enough to fool others, but Egg, who knew him a little, was half believing and half doubting. However, he did not ask any more questions, but said seriously, "Anyway, thank you, sir. Thank you for fighting for us." Renly was speechless at the bold boy's little adult appearance, but then he thought of something and suddenly said, "If you want to thank me, promise me one thing." "What is it?" the boy asked seriously. "If I die unfortunately, please take good care of Rhea for me," he said. In fact, he wanted to find Sister Adarat first. After all, she was an experienced old man, more stable and kind. But she left the temple for some reason, and no one knew where she ran to. "Rhea? Why does Sir care so much about that mute?" The boy was very puzzled when he heard it. It was impossible for him not to know what others knew, and he even met Rhea several times later, and he also knew what Renly was doing, so the boy was very curious why Renly cared about such an annoying guy. Shouldn't normal people hate, reject or ignore it? "She is my half-sister." Renly had no intention of telling the truth, nor did he talk about the so-called redemption words, but pretended to be serious and said, "I observed for a long time, and finally confirmed that it was her." I originally came to King's Landing to find her, but I didn't tell anyone, so I asked you to help me take care of her." This made the boy a little confused, but seeing Renly's serious look, he reacted instantly. "No one knows this? Even she doesn't know. You are the first," Renly replied. The boy pursed his lips when he heard it and suddenly asked, "Are we friends, sir?" "Of course, so you must help your friends. I swear." "Thank you for the 10,000 reward from Sanchia's Hey book friend. Thank you for the 1,000 reward from Heath's T book friend and Liu Zip book friend. Thank you for the 200 reward from Gyaxiao book friend. Thank you for the 100 reward from Imioniana book friend, Yunhei Zenran book friend, Bionic Hardware Accessories book friend, Kindian book friend and book friend." 201908140342257990 for the 100 reward. Chapter 110 The Trial of the Seven Sons. That night, Renly told the boy many things again, and after ensuring that he could remember them well, he fell asleep with a little peace of mind, and the development of things did not exceed his expectations. Before dawn the next day, Renly was awakened by Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warrior's sons. After a conversation, he was sent to the city to invite Kingsguard Renly Baratheon to discuss the trial at noon today. What this means is self-evident. Renly quickly found Kingsguard Renly, who was living in a hotel in the city. The two had planned to drag the church into the water, and Raymond deliberately avoided many people who were indignant and wanted to participate, so he naturally would not refuse such an invitation. Renly brought him back to the Temple of Thought smoothly. The most important thing is to ensure the safety of Sir Raymond. When the morning light gradually appeared, a total of 7 fully armed knights stood in a circle under the statue in the temple square and began to discuss the upcoming trial. Surprisingly, Renly knew all these people. The leader of the warrior's sons, Nancy Tarbeck, the training officer, Knight Owen, the humorous twins of the Castle family, the serious Knight Mori, and their 2 Baratheons. If Sir Raymond, who accused Mika, dies, then this trial will be equivalent to declaring the other party's victory, so we must avoid this. Leader Nancy Tarbeck spoke with a serious face, and the people around him who were listening with helmets in their arms also looked serious. Raymond Baratheon, the person involved, bowed to them and saluted to express his gratitude. "We don't know who the enemy has summoned at the moment, but we can roughly guess that Wit of the Roston family, Dale of the Darklyn family, Roan, the bastard of Maiden Spring City, and the people of Crabclaw Peninsula." After saying some names, Leader Nancy changed the subject. "But no matter who it is, our chances of winning are very high, because we have what the enemy doesn't have." As he said this, he glanced at Renly. His eyes were mixed with anger and relief, and his emotions were very complicated. The others were in a similar mood, except for Raymond Baratheon of the Kingsguard, who was a little confused. He didn't know about the lance stand. As long as there are no mistakes in the charge, then we can basically determine the outcome in one round. At the very least, we can eliminate more than half of the enemies, and then the other half will naturally not be a concern. This made the people around smile. Simply casting a breastplate takes a long time, but if the original breastplate is melted and a small part is added, it will be relatively simple. So even though it didn't take long, they were basically equipped with that special auxiliary part. But to take advantage of this, we should make sure that our weapons can hit the enemy more easily. So I think it is more appropriate to use a 12-foot long jousting lance instead of an 8-foot long iron-tipped lance. Jousting lances are too fragile, easy to break, and cannot penetrate armor. As long as we can make sure that all enemies are knocked off their horses, then victory will naturally belong to us. As they continued to talk, more and more warrior sons gathered around them, but these people did not rush to approach and disturb them, but watched from a distance. They all knew about the trial of the 7 sons today, and they were also clear about the meaning of the success or failure of these 7 people. The 7 knights turned a blind eye to this and concentrated on discussing the battle that would take place soon, until an archbishop of the Sanctuary of Thoughts came to bless them and personally led the team to the bottom of the hill. There were many onlookers on the roadside. Renly thought he would be criticized, but he was cheered and encouraged. A big man with a rough face shouted at him in the crowd. A girl in a headscarf threw flowers for him when she passed by, and many people in the crowd called his particularly simple name. I don't know what this matter has become in one night, but it is obvious that the people in King's Landing and the church have completely different ideas. After you dismount, you will die. A low voice came from the side. Turning around, the middle-aged Knight Murray with a square chin was staring at him seriously with his brown eyes. So you must ensure that you can knock the enemy off the horse without any accidents during the charge, so that you can survive this trial. Fortunately, you have invented a good thing for yourself, which can increase your chances of winning. Before Renly could say anything, someone on the other side interrupted with a smile. Good sir, don't look down on our lemon sergeant so much. The speaker was the training officer Knight Owen. He has great physical strength and excellent recovery ability. His endurance is better than any of us. Don't underestimate him. Sir Lemon is also very good at drinking. One of the twins on the other side interrupted and said, if this is the way of trial, the enemy will definitely lose everything. Shut up, Ammon. Why are you still joking at this time? The other twin scolded. Damn it, Ammon, at this time, you are still framing me? The one who spoke first stared at his brother in surprise. I'm Almon. The two brown-haired twins over there were insulting each other, and the atmosphere gradually became lively. Even Captain Nancy, who was worried, smiled when he heard the noise behind him, but Knight Murray beside him still had a serious face. I don't believe that the enemy can give you time to recover after the battle begins. He still reminded Renly. So what they said is not important at all. Lemon, you must remember this. You can't dismount. Even if you can deal with the enemy who is charging you, you can't dismount. It's hard to win by moving around, using spears and swords. His tone was old-fashioned, but he could clearly feel the worry in his heart. Renly nodded seriously when he heard it. Thank you, Sir Maury. His gratitude was sincere. Living in this era, from a civilian farmer who was picked up to a knight, and then to a warrior's son, it was certainly because of the deeds of Sir Laren before his death. But without the careful care of the man in front of him, he would never have been able to eat for free in the church so smoothly. Although these helps are insignificant and the other party never mentions them, they are crucial, and Renly always sees them. I'm an old friend of Sir Laren, and I should take good care of his descendants, Sir Maury said, patting Renly's arm. The gods will bless you, Lemon. After saying that, he kicked his spurs and approached Captain Nancy in front and started talking again. At this time, the team had already walked beyond the range of Rena's Hill. An archbishop in a brown robe walked at the front with a scepter, and 7 knights rode behind him. There were many other warrior sons following around, and groups of monks and nuns were on the periphery. There were countless members of the Poor People's Assembly, and even ordinary people following, so the team was huge and very eye-catching once it appeared. Even more than that, the whole King's Landing was in motion at this time. Looking down from the sky, you can see countless dense figures appearing from all over the city, and then spontaneously forming a line of ant-like teams, walking through the crowded or loose roads, and rushing towards the Lion Gate, King Gate and River Gate among the 7 gates of King's Landing. The arena is on the outskirts of the city, and these 3 gates are the closest. Ordinary combat trials naturally would not cause such a grand scene, but the trial of the 7 sons has not been seen for 100 years, not to mention the confrontation between the church and the Targaryen family, which is the first time in history, and no one wants to miss it. However, this relatively orderly progress suddenly became very chaotic after a loud and vast roar. People hurriedly looked up at the sky, or pushed and shoved towards the buildings on both sides. Some people who had just left the house decisively returned to the house, and decided not to join in the fun. Just a dragon roar, everyone was instantly in chaos. The 7 warrior sons participating in the trial were surprised and doubtful, and even stopped the team's progress. However, the roar only lasted for a while. After they continued on their way, nothing happened until they passed through the gate of King's Landing, and arrived at the arena outside the city. All they saw were 7 enemies dressed in different clothes. Chapter 111 The Trial of the 7 Sons. The arena was near the King's Gate in King's Landing. It was a vast grassland. On both sides of the grassland were the audience seats separated by fences. Now, a large number of people were pouring out from the khaki city, shrouded in morning mist not far away, and heading towards the audience seats. Many people had already sat there. In the stands in the center of the audience seats sat the 2 judges of the tournament trial. One was the brown-robed Archbishop of the Sanctuary of Thought, and the other was an old lady who looked to be in her 60s. She wore a dark black satin robe, had a rigid face, thin eyebrows, and wrinkles all over her face, but her back was straight and full of fierce temperament. Renly, who was standing at the south end of the grassland, had never seen her, but guessed that she should be the Conqueror's great queen, the current Queen Mother Visenya. He felt quite strange that this old man was so old, but he paid more attention to the 7 people who were confronting them a few hundred yards away on the opposite side of the grassland. On his left was a Murray knight in silver armor, and on his right was one of the brown-haired twins. Like Renly, they were both wearing standard armor over a linen robe embroidered with a crystal sword. Some squires dressed as monks were checking the buckles of their armor to see if they were tightly fastened, not missing any details. The same was true for the people opposite them, but their armor and helmets were of different shapes. Some were plain, some were fancy, some were enameled and looked bright and eye-catching, and some were only the color of steel, quietly gleaming with a cold luster in the morning light. Among them, Renly paid special attention to 2 people. One of them was a tall and strong middle-aged man with brown hair who was facing him. He was wearing a gorgeous brown-yellow armor and a more fancy smock over the armor. On the oblique orange-black background of the smock was embroidered a black and orange reverse color that looked like a burning castle. This was the enemy he would face next. He was not close enough to see anything special when he looked closely, but from the emblem, Renly could confirm his origin. He was the ruler of Irenal in the Riverlands, and a member of the Harrowway family. This was a lord family that had long been extinct in his time, but it was now prominent, or about to take off, because the second woman that Meager married was from this family. Unlike the rules of the tournament, the trial of the 7 required the knights to charge head-on with lances, rather than attacking from the side with a railing protecting them. There was no room for easing, and the degree of cruelty and the casualty rate were naturally not comparable to ordinary tournaments. Renly was alert to the fact that his opponent's physique was comparable to his own. In addition, he was particularly concerned about another tall man wearing black armor, with dragon head decorations on his helmet and shoulder armor. He was wearing a knee-length robe with a black background and a red dragon. The long sword he held in both hands was dull in color, but had a special sharpness. He was talking to someone beside him, and his eyes occasionally glanced over, but he didn't seem to care much about the people in the church. He was Meager Targaryen, the 3rd king to sit on the Iron Throne, the most famous tyrant of the future Targaryen dynasty. However, Renly didn't observe for long before his sight was blocked. He saw Nancy Tarbeck, the leader of the warrior's son, stepping in front of the knights, and then said to them, "The next battle is crucial. Each of us must go all out, either life or death. I don't need to worry about the others. You are all qualified knights. Only you, Lemon," he said, looking at Renly with annoyance in his eyes, but also a hint of encouragement. "It's not that you don't have a chance of winning. Lance charge mainly relies on riding skills, and your riding skills are not bad. What you provide makes up for one of your shortcomings. The only thing you lack is experience. So when you go on the field, you need to pay attention to focus. Focus on all the enemy's actions, and react faster than the enemy. Only in this way can you play your advantage." The insiders of the church always believed that Renly was likely to die here, because he had only been a knight for a short time, and he was a young boy from a commoner family. Although he did something amazing, it had nothing to do with what the trial required. No matter from which aspect, he could not beat those senior knights in this special night duel. In fact, if possible, they would have asked Renly to give up his position long ago. After all, this matter is very critical to the church and there can be no mistakes. Unfortunately, someone's move ahead of them made them helpless, and they could only accept it with a pinch of their noses. In a sense, this behavior is equivalent to bullying. It is no wonder that many high-ranking officials of the church are dissatisfied with Renly. The Captain Nancy was the same before, but now he stared at him very seriously and said, "Your enemy is Cole Harrowway. He is a famous knight, but he is arrogant. Your information is easy to find, so he may underestimate you. This may be your chance, Lemon. Grasp it and you will win." At this time, the judge at the central stand summoned representatives from both sides to come forward, so Captain Nancy patted him on the shoulder and finally said, "If we can survive this trial, then I hope to have a good talk with you." After he said that, he jumped on the horse and rode towards that side with the king's good raiment, and the leader of the other side, Mika, did the same. They were going to have a final meeting, which also meant that the competition would begin soon. The atmosphere became more solemn. Renly felt that the captain's random flags were indeed a bit unlucky. Someone beside him seemed to think so he asked, "Lemon, are you nervous?" The one who asked the question was one of the brown-haired twins, who was looking at him sideways with a serious look. "A little bit." Renly told the truth. "It seems that you can't guess who I am." The other party said with some disappointment, "I was thinking of asking you again before I die, but forget it now. People who are nervous will become stupid. You are Ammon." Renly rolled his eyes. Seeing the other party's surprise, he said, "Because Ammon has bad breath, but Almond doesn't." This made the other party joke. He even lowered his head suspiciously and covered his mouth with his hands to smell. His uneasy look made the people around him laugh unconsciously, and the solemn atmosphere was relaxed a lot, but they still couldn't completely get rid of the heaviness brought by the environment. At this time, not only the audience seats on both sides, but also the open spaces on the north and south of the arena had been occupied. The dense crowd seemed to be tens of thousands. Although no one made any noise, the countless trivial sounds gathered together and still seemed very noisy. There were too many people here, and he couldn't see anything outside. After a quick look, Renly found two familiar figures in the stands, where the clergy were. This made him frown unconsciously, but the competition was about to begin, and he didn't want to pay much attention to these two people, who were asked to stay in the city, but rushed over rashly. After Captain Nancy and the King's Good returned, everyone on the spot jumped on their horses, and the servants who served them hurriedly handed over shields and spears. Although Renly did not bring his servants, there were still monks who came to help. The black warhorse he rode had also been wearing a horsehead armor, a breastplate, and a mail blanket. So from the outside, he looked like everyone else in the same row, riding on horseback and looking majestic. "Remember the plan we agreed on?" After the last exhortation, the leader of the warrior's son, Nancy Tarbeck, buckled his steel helmet tightly, held the 12-foot-long training spear in his hand, rode on the horse, bent his back slightly, and stared at the opposite side. The same was true for everyone else, including the enemy. The two sides were silently confronting each other across the arena, and the invisible confrontation seemed to have begun. When a horn sounded, 7 war horses began to trot towards the opposite side. Bending over, his body rose and fell in accordance with the posture of the war horses running. Renly held the lance tightly in his hand. The whistling wind around him gradually rose, and the sound of the collision between the plate armor and the mail armor was faintly audible. His heart beat more and more violently like a drum. Apart from that, he ignored other sounds in the surrounding environment, the shouting of the crowd, the rushing of the river, the fluttering of the birds, the whistling of the horses. The running rhythm of the war horses under him became more and more rapid. From the initial trot gradually turned into a fierce gallop, and the rumbling sound of the horses' hooves hitting the ground and the trembling of the horse's body were like an earthquake. Due to the limitation of the helmet, Renly could not see the situation of his companions on both sides except for the front. He could only see that the knights' lances wrapped in colorful stripes were pointing to the front. But then he no longer paid attention to what he saw from the corner of his eye. His eyes were focused on the enemy on the opposite side. The enemy, dressed in gorgeous armor and rushing at high speed, became taller and more obvious. The burly physique, the dark yellow robe fluttering in the wind, the castle emblem on the shield, and the lance that was tilted upward and did not look sharp at the front. The most important lance. Renly on horseback suddenly woke up. The opponent was using the same lance as them at the moment, which was also a 12-foot-long training lance, not an 8-foot-long real war lance with a sharp tip. But all this was discovered too late, because the time for the confrontation had already arrived. Looking down from the sky, 7 fully armed knights on each side rushed towards each other on the grass like 14 arrows, and the lances suddenly aimed at their respective targets at the appropriate moments. Then, at that instant, several loud noises were suddenly heard due to the extremely fast collision, horses neighing, people screaming, and the crowd around them suddenly clamoring. All kinds of sounds seemed to be born at the same time, just like the long accumulated judgment suddenly erupted. Death and blood splashed, exclamations and roars rang out. At the last moment, Renly tried his best to command his horse to crash into the opponent's horse instead of avoiding it from the side. As a result, the lance in his hand ignored the enemy's precise shield and instantly hit the opponent's fancy robe on the left chest. The lance ring and lance rack matched the speed of the warhorse's charge in the heavy collision. With the sudden shattering of the two lances, the tall figure on the opposite horse was immediately lifted up and spun by the huge impact force, and then fell to the grass in the distance, making a violent sound of armor friction. His arms moved slightly, and then he lay there motionless, as if he had lost his strength. But this does not mean that Renly won. The recoil from the collision between the two horses galloping at high speed made him dizzy, and he was also unable to avoid the enemy's attack, and his breastplate was dented. Fortunately, the enemy did not expect him to be so crazy, so the attack angle did not fully exert the power of the charge, but it also made Renly's upper body lean back for a while, before he barely stood up, feeling a burst of blood-spurting pain in his body, as if his whole heart was about to be shattered by the impact. Even more unfortunate was that the left eye of the warhorse under him was deeply pierced by a piece of broken lance wood, which made the horse stagger and finally fell to the ground with a whimper. The knight on horseback fell off the horse in one fell swoop. Thank you to Heath Iced T, DBG, Suhan Z, and Flying DUTCH** for the 1000 UN reward. Thank you to Union and 201908140342257990 for the 100 UN reward. Chapter 112 The Trial of the Seven Sons. A lot of things happened in an instant. The enemy's strategy was obviously to use a longer training lance to knock the warrior sons off their horses, but they met the same response. As a result, the situation did not develop as anyone imagined. At the moment of the confrontation, the leader of the warrior sons, Captain Nancy, avoided the charge of the enemy opposite him, and at the same time, used the lance in his hand to knock the opponent off his horse. However, Knight Owen beside him was caught off guard by the attack, guided by the warhorse under him, because the enemy suddenly aimed at the eyes of the horse under him. Then he fell to the ground with the warhorse, and suddenly screamed, and his legs were obviously broken by the heavy warhorse. The enemy wanted to take advantage of the situation to kill him directly, but Knight Murray, who had successfully dealt with the opponent on the side, suddenly rushed over and confronted him head-on. One of the twin warrior sons successfully stabbed the lance at the opponent's neck armor. The huge impact seemed to directly break the opponent's neck, and he easily blocked the enemy's attack with his shield. Unfortunately, his brother who had joked with Renly before the battle was not so lucky. His lance hit the enemy's shield, and he was also thrown off his horse. After rolling and struggling for a long time, he started a foot battle with the enemy, who had also fallen off his horse. In the trial, the most important battle was between the challenger and the challenged. Mika, wearing carved black dragon armor, faced Raymond, a Kingsguard wearing a white robe. Although Baratheon was very skilled, Mika, who had been trained since childhood and had special blood, was even more amazing in strength and skills. Raymond's lance not only did not hit the enemy, but he was knocked off his horse by a blow. Although he did not die, he fell to the ground gasping for breath, as if several ribs were broken. So the victorious Captain Nancy on the other side could only rush forward to deal with it. After one round of battle, the situation caught everyone off guard. The only active members of the warrior sons were Captain Nancy, Knight Murray, and the twins. The enemy side only had 3 left. Although Nancy, the leader of the warrior sons, who seemed to have an advantage, was actually no match for the brutal and tyrannical Targaryen, she was forced to retreat as soon as the battle began. The twin who easily defeated the enemy had to join in and start a 2-on-1 battle to barely hold on. Knight Murray, one of the 2 remaining, tied with the enemy, while the last twin was at a disadvantage. It seemed that the previous fall from the horse had broken his sword hand, so he was now very passive and looked like he might lose at any time. Combat skills are important, but sometimes luck is also crucial. Although the existence of the lance rack strengthened the power of the charge and the mastery of the lance, this enhanced advantage was reduced to the lowest point when the enemy used weapons of the same length. It was not clear whether the enemy was lucky enough to see the opportunity first, or someone leaked the news. The vast grassland under the sunlight was surrounded by people on both sides. Everyone in the audience was closely watching everything in the arena and exclaimed from time to time. In the crowd, a bald boy was trying hard to pull a thin figure to prevent her from leaving the seat. There were several other nuns helping him. The noise was not small, but it did not attract the attention of anyone watching the trial. The sound of steel clashing continued to sound from the grass. The three battles were fierce. As soon as they started, the knight Owen, who had broken his leg, took off his helmet and threw it aside, revealing a sticky blonde hair. He struggled to crawl to the side of the key figure, the king's guard, who fell to the ground and gasped, and protected him behind him. He looked at the remaining companion who fell off the horse, but seemed not to be dead not far away, and his eyes were full of expectation, but then turned into disappointment. After the advantage of the lance was weakened, the new knight named Lemon was still able to get rid of the opponent at the last moment. The result was actually quite beyond his expectations, but the blonde figure who fell off the horse seemed unable to get up. He lay on the ground with his chest rising and falling, but he did not make any other movements, as if his ribs were broken. This made Knight Owen feel depressed, and he could not help but glance at the brown-haired twin companions who were at a disadvantage in the arena. I told you to joke around before the start, you idiots. Now you are getting your retribution. The panting Knight Owen muttered, with a bitter look on his face, but then he suddenly found that the arm of the tall companion lying on the ground not far away suddenly moved a little, which made him slightly stunned. After glancing at the current situation, he gritted his teeth and picked up a little mud from the ground and made a ball, and then threw it at the tall companion on the edge of the arena. The helmet that became stuffy due to panting blocked most of the noise coming from outside, but he could still hear bursts of noise coming from nearby. It seemed that there were onlookers cheering him up, constantly urging him to stand up, and there were also feigned curses, as if the enemy supporters were angry with him. However, facing all this, Renly felt quite bewildered. His mind was dazed, and he felt as if he was in a dream and couldn't understand his own situation. At this moment, all he could do was breathe and stare blankly. The impact of the two horses combined with the attack of the enemy made him unable to react when the war horse collapsed. After falling to the ground dully, he faced another impact, which made his injuries even worse. Combined with all these situations, he felt dizzy at this time. His heart beat obviously abnormally, and his whole thinking was strangely trapped in a state similar to dream, or a state of half asleep and half awake. He didn't know how long he had been in this state, but suddenly a series of knocks came into his ears, making him feel like someone was knocking on the door. Renly wanted to get up and open the door, but his dream instinct made him stay where he was, as if this was the right thing to do, so he listened quietly to the knocks and was unmoved. In a daze, he thought of a very classic question, "Who am I?" The knocks continued, and the question remained in his heart. He wanted to stop thinking about it, but he felt that this question seemed very important. It was just that the ubiquitous haze and dream around him had been shrouding him, making Renly's thinking very slow and confused at this time, and he could not figure out the root of the problem. It was not until a feeling of falling into an ice cellar suddenly emerged from his body, and until the color of his eyes hidden in the steel helmet quietly changed from emerald green to ice blue, that the blonde knight felt his rapidly beating heart ease. At the same time, as soon as this feeling was born, the confusion in his head was suddenly blown away like fog encountering a strong wind, which made him shudder and sit up directly. Because of the helmet on his head, his vision was severely obstructed, but it did not affect Renly's clear view of the current situation. What he saw was a vast dark green grassland, with messy horses and fierce fighting on the grassland, and in the densely packed audience seats opposite the grassland, countless people seemed to be shouting something at him, and there were also waves of deafening noises behind him like a tide. Turning his head, he saw an old man leaning out of the guardrail, and now he was yelling at him with a red face. The spit splashing out was clearly visible, mixed with the expectation of Renly, splashing all over his silver-plated breastplate that was stained with mud and had a punctured robe. "Stand up, Sir Lemon, stand up quickly." Go and defeat those monsters. They need you. Yes, we all need you. You have a really loud voice. Renly murmured in response, looking down at his chest. What is this there? The other party shouted. The surrounding voices were too loud, and normal words could not be heard at all. Without responding, Renly had already climbed up at this time. After a glance around, he suddenly found that both sides of the battle had already started fighting on foot, and no one was riding horses to meet the enemy. This made him move his heart, and temporarily gave up a certain battle plan he had thought of before the battle, and instead quickly ran towards a companion's intact warhorse not far away. As he ran, a cool feeling gradually spread throughout his body. The pain in his heart and the pain from falling off his horse gradually eased, as if he had applied ice to his body after being burned. He felt a sense of comfort. This seemed to be the work of the mutated blood power in his body. Renly could not figure out why this power could still work when they were not in the same body. He did not want to think about this long-standing problem. He approached the warhorse and turned over without hesitation. The dense crowd around him cheered fiercely, obviously excited about this resurrection drama and the changes that would be made after the Blonde Knight joined the battle. At this moment, inexplicably, there seemed to be an invisible force rushing in, so that the knowledge about knights such as riding horses, lances, swords, and shields quickly flashed through the Blonde Knight's mind on horseback. At the same time, his heart, which had originally calmed down a lot, began to beat rapidly again. The previous charge and impact had not yet fully recovered, so that facing this sudden change in speed, waves of pain unconsciously emerged and spread from his chest. But then, a piece of information that had not been heard for a long time suddenly appeared. You have obtained the profession, Knight. Chapter 113 The Trial of the Seven Sons. You have obtained the occupation, Knight. You have obtained the occupational feature, the Singing Spirit. The two pieces of information in succession made Renly look a little dazed, but then his mind suddenly became clear and focused, which was somewhat similar to the feeling when he woke up from the cracks before, but more obvious. At the same time, his whole body seemed to be full of strength. When he looked at the battlefield, he felt a warlike mood that made him a little eager to move. This situation might be due to the newly acquired occupational feature, but the current situation did not allow much room for hesitation and thinking, and there was no explanatory text, so Renly ignored it for the time being. The warhorse under him neighed and kicked his feet while being ridden, and was very resistant to Renly, who was not unfamiliar but also unfamiliar. The Blonde Knight sitting on it calmed it down after a while, and then the tall knight in silver-plated armor reached out and grabbed a weapon hanging on the side of the horse. It was a ferocious-looking mace, with a cloth wrapped around the handle and a sharp and angular hammerhead shining in the sun. After taking a quick look at the current battle situation, the knight on horseback clamped his horse's belly and trotted towards the enemy with a robe embroidered with black bats who was fighting on foot with the original owner of the horse. The arena was quite large, with the shouts of countless spectators. The brown tall warhorse carrying the Iron Knight turned from a trot to a gallop. Such obvious horse hoof sounds naturally could not escape the ears of the enemy with the bat emblem, so he changed his movements and seemed to want to find cover. But at this moment, Ammon, one of the brown-haired twins who also noticed his companions rushing towards him, suddenly entangled him desperately. Although the sword in his left hand was clumsy, he swung it at a very fast speed every time, completely ignoring the flaws in his armor that were exposed when he was wide open, so that in just a few breaths, he had a new wound on his body. The enemy was thus dragged to the spot. As he leaned over and tried to counterattack, the Iron Knight charged forward, and a mace with the sound of wind slammed into his face. The enemy with the bat emblem rolled on the ground without hesitation, ready to avoid the enemy's charge, but the knight on horseback seemed to have anticipated this. As the enemy rolled on the ground, the charging knight tightly grasped the reins, suddenly leaned over and slightly turned to the side of the horse, and swung the heavy mace in his right hand violently towards the enemy's forehead that was caught off guard on the ground. The heavy hammerhead broke through the air and hit the target. Without any surprise, there was a strong muffled sound. The knight with the black bat embroidered on his robe was directly hit by the sudden close-range attack, and his upper body bounced back to the ground, making a roar of armor friction and a faint sound of bones cracking. Then blood flowed out from under the obviously sunken helmet. Renly was not good at using weapons, but he was good at riding. At the same time, the special feeling that filled his body not only made him concentrate in the battle, but also seemed to have more strength and courage, so that he took the risk of doing this seemingly majestic, but actually quite dangerous action. The action was dangerous, but the effect was outstanding and quite entertaining. The enemy on the ground twitched a few times, and then stopped moving. It was obvious that he had been killed by the hammer. The audience around exclaimed, and many people called his name. In a trance, Renly felt that he seemed to be in a better state. Ammon, the brown-haired twin who was staggering in armor, laughed at him, then fell to the ground with a flop. His joints were bleeding, and he was obviously exhausted. However, he still shouted hoarsely to Renly, "Go to support, Lemon, don't worry about me." This guy looked energetic, but I didn't know how injured he was. The knight on horseback didn't have time to think about these things. After nodding to the other party, he turned his horse's head and ran towards other enemies with the mace. At this time, the captain, Nancy, and the other twin, Almon, were working together to deal with the tall Meager wearing black dragon armor, while Knight Murray was fighting back and forth with the knight with a yellow and black checkered emblem on his shield. However, despite their concentration on the battle, what was happening over there still did not escape their eyes, so the remaining two enemies were shocked, but their own morale was boosted. The galloping warhorse rushed towards Knight Murray fiercely, swinging the sharp mace towards the enemy's head as before, but the enemy nimbly avoided it. However, because of the distraction of dodging, Knight Murray saw an opportunity and stabbed the opponent's armpit with a sword, causing a splash of blood, but the enemy also dodged at the moment of being attacked, so the sword could only be considered a minor injury. They continued to fight, but the injured enemy was obviously at a disadvantage. Renly did not rashly intervene, but just trotted around the two battlefields, swinging the mace in his hand from time to time, and the whole person seemed to be ready to move. From time to time, he pretended to rush at the enemy, but it was just a fake move. But once, he turned the fake into real, and launched a second charge. So he rushed forward with a mace wrapped in a gust of wind. The enemy barely avoided the forehead, but was hit hard on the shoulder. With the sound of broken bones, he screamed and staggered back, holding his shoulder. Knight Murray, who saw the opportunity, quickly launched a counterattack, and knocked him to the ground. Finally, he opened his visor and thrust the long sword in his hand. After a sudden scream, only the last Meager was still resisting in this trial. But there were 4 of them. A round of cheers broke out again. Most of the people standing in the audience and outside the railings were satisfied, but reluctant to watch the battle in the field. They generally believed that the result of this trial was already determined. The old lady who had been sitting dignified at the trial seat became gloomy and terrible. Obviously, she did not expect this result to happen. But all this changed completely in the next moment. The victorious Knight Murray and Renly rushed to another battlefield, but before they reached the battlefield, the change suddenly occurred. After a clash, the sword in the hands of the twin warrior sons named Almon suddenly broke, and the enemy ignored the attack from Captain Nancy on the other side, and took advantage of Almon's unprepared attack to stab the ancient-looking longsword in his hand into the eye gap of his helmet. After a muffled scream, the warrior son died on the spot. Although Captain Nancy's sword hit Meager's forehead backward, it did not seem to make him dizzy. Instead, the tall enemy roared and quickly launched a counterattack. With a violent burst of action, Captain Nancy hurriedly launched a defense, but after a few strokes, the weapon in his hand also collapsed into several pieces and scattered all over the ground. In the face of the surging longsword, he could only use the steel wrist guards on both hands to barely resist, without any resistance. However, after forcing him to retreat, Meager ignored the enemy who had lost the possibility of attacking, but turned and ran towards the direction where the Kingsguard had collapsed on the other side, ready to kill the challenger directly, to end this ever-changing trial of the 7 sons. The Blackfire Sword, the inherited sword of the Targaryen family, was once used by Aegon the Conqueror. It is said to be made of Valyrian steel refined with magic. It is sharp and tough, and ordinary weapons are simply incomparable. Thank you Jovial Zoo for the 2000 reward. Thank you Heath Ice-G for the 1000 reward. Thank you Bayi Kuang and Ehux for the 500 reward. Thank you Huang Dao Huanan. 201709271516144250 for the 200 reward. Thank you to Arx an astrologer, Sukubo, Kindikain, Yanzinayu, an old father. The world of life and death has many resentments, and the stupid student who strives to become a top student. For the 100 rewards. Chapter 114 The Trial of the Seven Sons. The sudden change in the battle situation caught everyone off guard. Renly urged his horse to run forward, passing the Knight Murray who was also running beside him, and raised his mace horizontally to smash the enemy. However, the enemy dodged it lightly by leaning back and stepping sideways, and at the same time, he instantly raised his sharp sword and swept it across the back of the charging horse. The horse's buttocks were not protected by a lock blanket, and the Valyrian steel sword, which was said to be made by magic, was also extremely sharp. The wound was so deep that the bone could be seen. So after a painful neigh, the horse staggered, and its hind legs softened and it almost fell to the ground. Renly hurriedly pulled back to prevent the horse from collapsing directly, but it was obvious that it could not continue to charge. However, looking back, because of this delay, Captain Nancy, who was left behind, was entangled with Mika, who was wearing majestic black armor, holding a shield picked up from the ground and a dagger in his hand, and was struggling to defend and wait for an opportunity to counterattack. The only warrior sons who could still fight at this time, apart from Renly, were Captain Nancy and Knight Murray who rushed over behind. The remaining twins were lying not far away, sad and angry at the death of their brother, but the previous battle seemed to have injured his joints and he could not get up, so he could only keep crawling over here. Knight Owen, whose leg was broken by the warhorse, also slumped on the ground, with the pale-faced Kingsguard behind him. Fortunately, the enemy only had one person left, Mika, who was wearing armor glazed with a red dragon emblem. The others were either lying on the ground in a coma, or had died quietly but no one cared. Knight Murray and Captain Nancy worked together to fight Mika. Fighting for a long time in heavy armor seemed to make them full of fatigue, so that their reactions in battle became slower and slower, but the enemy did not seem to encounter this problem, and every move was still fierce. The horses in the pasture were in a mess, and the bodies of the knights in armor were scattered everywhere. The horses under him could no longer fight. After getting off the horses, Renly prepared to get another horse to fight the enemy, but the appearance of one agile and the other slow made him hesitate. Would his charge reach the enemy, or would the enemy take advantage of his companion's slow reaction to contain him? After thinking about it, he gave up the idea of looking for horses, and instead rushed towards the enemy with the mace in his hand. At this time, the battle situation seemed a little precarious. Knight Murray, who hurriedly used his sword to block Mika's blow, saw Renly running towards him from the corner of his eye, and couldn't help but curse. "Are you running here to die?" "Yes." While Captain Nancy was hitting Mika's waist with her shield, to make him relax his pressure, Renly ran over with gritted teeth and answered loudly. His movements were not slow, and his mace hit the enemy's forehead directly. As a result, Mika, who ignored the impact of the shield and seemed to be rooted in the ground, had to step back, avoiding the fatal attack and giving up the action of suppressing Knight Murray. The middle-aged knight who was half kneeling on the ground stood up panting. The enemy did not launch an attack for the time being because of the presence of these three people. He panted and began to concentrate on confronting them. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Renly directly put the mace in his hand into the hands of Captain Nancy beside him. At the same time, under the other party's stunned expression, he took out a blue dagger he carried with him and used it to cut off the concave breastplate straps on his chest and the heavy leg armor buckles on his legs. Finally, he took off the barrel silver helmet on his head that was very obstructing his vision, and threw it away, leaving only the silver mail and loose leather armor and trousers on his body. The enemy was a little stunned by this, and his companions were even more horrified. "Are you crazy?" Knight Murray shouted in a low voice, looking at the young man's anxious appearance as he took the initiative to remove his armor. It is easy to remove the armor, but it is difficult to put it on. Now that he is in a battle, it is basically impossible for this man to wear armor again. However, without the protection of plate armor, facing the enemy's extremely sharp Valyrian steel sword, the mail and leather armor on his body alone can't defend against any attack, and even facing the enemy's stab, it can't defend against it at all. "I'll create an opportunity," Renly answered without waiting for a response. He turned the dagger in his hand and rushed towards the black figure who was staring at them vigilantly. The short distance of a few steps passed in a flash. Facing the unarmed blonde knight, Mika, who was wearing black armor, felt strange, but he still clenched the long sword in his hand and chopped it without hesitation. The sharp weapon shone brightly under the sunlight. He aimed at Renly's forehead and moved as fast as lightning. It seemed that he would cut off his skull in the next moment. What Renly thought of at this time was the teachings of the brown-haired twins who had died tragically on the training ground. So when the opponent's weapon attacked, the blonde figure who was bent over and rushed forward suddenly fell to the ground, narrowly dodged the attack, and rolled behind the enemy. Then, while the enemy was unable to react, he stabbed back without hesitation with the dagger in his hand. With a sudden muffled scream, Mika, who was a little slow to react and even failed to dodge completely, was stabbed in the back of his knee. Then his steps became chaotic, and the weapon in his hand was shaken a little when facing the golden-haired figure who was dodging like a donkey. It just barely swept across his back, leaving a scar of cutting the mail, but no bloodstains appeared. After rolling on the ground, Renly, who was covered with grass, stood up nimbly, and then grinned at the 2-on-1 battle that was unfolding again not far away. It's not easy to fight or meet shields. Obviously, no one could hear the muttered words. Although his sudden change in fighting style was unexpected, the only two remaining warrior sons did not hesitate at all. When they saw the opportunity, they directly stuck to him. The sound of metal clashing rang out again. 3 figures, 1 black and 2 silver, moved back and forth to attack and defend. At the edge of the battle, a tall figure holding a dagger and slightly tense at the waist was pacing around, staring at the enemy. The few strands of golden hair on his forehead, which were clinging to his forehead due to sweat, seemed to reflect faintly under the sun. In the distance of the grass, 3 knights were slumped there. One of them had broken legs and could not move. The other was bleeding from the gaps in his armor. They stared at the battle without blinking, with tense expressions. The last one in a white robe was panting and unable to get up, which made a bold boy in the audience sigh and feel embarrassed. But he was still quite excited because he felt that the victory of this battle was basically finalized. So while he was relaxed, the boy Ego found that there seemed to be something wrong beside him. There was a constant noise around, and everyone in the crowded audience was shouting and yelling about the progress of the battle. Rhea, who was on the left of Ego, was sitting there obediently without any unusual behavior. After seeing the lively and energetic figure of the blonde, she stopped being restless. But on the right of Ego, he suddenly found that the nun who was originally sitting there had become another person. Sister Ada? After seeing her appearance, the boy asked curiously, "When did you come?" The nun had been missing for a while, and no one knew where she had gone. Because of her special status, her disappearance caused a lot of discussion in the church, but it was then covered up by the news of the trial of the 7 sons. The boy had originally speculated whether the nun had had an accident and would never come back, but now he suddenly saw her here and even felt a little strange about it in his heart. But Ego couldn't tell what was strange. Just arrived. The old man wrapped in a snow-white headscarf smiled at the boy and said, "Come and see a good show. Those that are not put on the shelves today will not be put on the shelves in the next few days. It may take more than 10 days to put them on the shelves. It depends on the arrangement of the website. In addition, when the books are put on the shelves, I expect to have 10 chapters, just like the last book, but I haven't accumulated enough, and I don't know if I can achieve it. I will confirm the specific number when I write my remarks. I have been suffering from a cold recently, and my teeth are always in trouble. I'm not in a good condition." Chapter 115 The Trial of the 7 Sons. The noise around the auditorium was very loud, and it spread in all directions along with the river breeze. Most people's minds were attracted by the battle scene below, but the words of the nun next to him made the boy temporarily ignore the situation below and turn to look strange. "You are late, Sister Ada. The show is almost over," the boy explained. "Not necessarily," the nun responded with a smile, raised her hand, and touched the boy's bald head. Under the other's slightly wrinkled nose, she whispered, "It's just beginning." The surrounding noise was too loud, and the boy Ego didn't hear this, but he felt that the nun seemed a little strange and a little familiar. "We haven't said a few words. Why are you touching my head?" Secretly a little disgusted, the boy shook his head instinctively. He was just expressing his dissatisfaction, but he found that the nun's hand was easily shaken off by him. Looking up, he found that the nun with black and white hair was staring at the situation in the arena. Following her gaze, Ego suddenly found that she was not looking at the blonde figure that everyone was paying attention to, but the besieged black-armored Mika. Although the battle was prolonged because of the tight armor they were wearing, the situation in the arena became clearer as time passed. In the dark green lawn arena, the blonde knight holding a dagger had been pacing slowly sideways and staring at the three people fighting, but he never took action again. It seemed that except for the unexpected attack at the beginning, he did not find another opportunity to intervene in the battle, and he seemed to be gathering his strength and ready to launch a fatal attack at any time. However, the overall situation did not change because of his observation. The enemy's movements affected by the leg wound were no longer as agile as before, and there was a noticeable sluggishness every time he moved his feet. At the same time, perhaps because he had been concentrating on the battle for too long, or perhaps because he was concerned about the presence of the man holding the dagger, the powerful warrior who was quite fierce in the Seven Kingdoms was not as fierce as before when launching an attack. His reaction became slow, his defense became slow, and he was even forced to retreat step by the sons of the two warriors on the opposite side. People thought that he was about to run out of energy and had no strength left. This was normal. The armor of the Knights of the Seven Kingdoms was designed not to affect fighting on foot, but it was not very light. Unfortunately, the remaining two people on the church side were also exhausted physically and mentally. There were many opportunities that came with the enemy's physical exhaustion, but they did not seize them at all. Although the enemy was constantly retreating, it seemed that the battle could not be resolved for a while if the blonde knight who still looked lively and energetic was not considered. Although it seemed that the man's actions at this time were obviously different from the knight's fighting style, except for some noble royalists, most of the people were very excited and even urged him to go forward and stab Mika to death and not drag it on. Obviously, the blonde figure ignored the roars coming from all around because he had been circling the battlefield without hurrying, but perhaps he was already angry because he was being suppressed, or the noise was too noisy. Mika, who had retreated to the fence of the arena, suddenly endured an attack from Knight Murray's armpit, just to chop the sword in his hand on Captain Nancy's forehead. His action was successful, but he did not kill Captain Nancy with one blow, but only knocked him a little dizzy, and even staggered, and his legs were weak. Seeing this, Knight Murray hurriedly turned in front of him to defend, but at this moment Mika ignored him and rushed towards Renly not far away, and the muffled sound under his helmet seemed particularly angry. "You despicable fellow, I'm going to skin you alive." The heavy footsteps accompanied by the muffled roars caused boos or cheers. Although his leg was injured and his armpit was bleeding, he seemed to completely ignore the pain and various injuries on his body at this moment, and his speed of running quickly did not seem slow. However, Renly took off his armor for the purpose of gaining dexterity and agility. When he saw the other party rushing towards him, he turned around and ran without hesitation, causing the other party to roar continuously, but he didn't even touch the corner of the enemy's clothes. This behavior naturally undermined the chivalry. Renly didn't care what the onlookers said about him, but he found that when he retreated, the special blessing power in his body, which was much weaker than the initial one, weakened again, and even became imperceptible. This gave him a basic understanding of the characteristics given by the knight profession, but this was naturally not a good time to think about it. Seeing that he could not be caught for a while, the angry enemy turned to rush towards the distant Kingsguard, but at this time, the two warrior sons who were left behind came up again. Captain Nancy, who was hit on the head, did not seem to be in any serious trouble. Although the weapon in his hand had been damaged, he held a round shield with a border for defense, while Knight Murray was mainly responsible for attacking. So the two exhausted men, one holding a shield and the other swinging a sword, continued to fight with the enemy who seemed to be full of energy, but whose movements were becoming increasingly slow. The sound of metal clashing continued, and it kept ringing like a special performance. Not long after, Renly, who was closely watching the battle situation, saw an opportunity and rushed over in an instant, which disrupted the rhythm. The enemy had strong defense, and with 2 warrior sons on the opposite side, it was not convenient for him to follow his previous behavior of rolling and stabbing his legs, so Renly aimed the dagger in his hand at his armpit. But before he could succeed in his attack, the enemy who had his back to him ignored the long sword swung by Knight Murray in front of him, turned around and kicked the golden-haired figure, accompanied by a dull roar, as if he was extremely angry about Renly's existence. The dagger in his hand could not resist this attack. At the critical moment, Renly did not retreat but advanced, holding the opponent's thigh before the kick came, and then pushed hard regardless of the impact of the huge force, directly knocking the man backward to the ground. Knight Murray's sword was deflected and hit the enemy's shoulder, while Captain Nancy, who was holding a shield on the side, pounced at the same time, holding the enemy's right hand holding the Valyrian steel sword tightly with both hands. This seemed to happen in an instant. The few people who were entangled before suddenly rolled into a ball. One hugged the leg, one pressed the arm, and the last one saw the opportunity and leaned on the sword in his hand to stab the enemy's neck lying on the ground, but the enemy dodged it with a tilt of his head. At the same time, the enemy's left hand, which was not bound by the steel glove, suddenly raised and grasped the long sword that was deeply inserted into the ground, then roared and pulled it hard. After a creaking sound, accompanied by the opposing force of Knight Murray holding the hilt, the sword was actually broken in one go. Obviously, the long sword that had been attacked by the Valyrian steel sword many times was already shaky, and this violent pull was just the last straw. But Knight Murray holding the sword was still caught off guard, so much so that he stumbled and collapsed on the enemy with a bang. The situation suddenly became 3 people holding down one, and Renly, who was holding his leg, was kicked hard in the ribs by the opponent's other foot. The top of the steel cast combat boot was pointed, and the impact caused Renly to feel a sharp pain, but this attack did not make him let go, but took the opportunity to hold the opponent's other leg tightly. The enemy roared in a muffled voice, and the strange power that suddenly emerged in his right hand almost made the exhausted Captain Nancy unable to suppress it. Seeing this, Knight Murray, who had climbed up, hurriedly lifted the visor of Meg's helmet, then clenched his fist with one hand and punched the opponent's handsome and unruly young face fiercely, while the other hand resisted the harassment of the opponent's left hand struggling. The fist came down, and the sound of the bridge of the nose bone cracked accompanied the opponent's muffled screams, which also made the situation of falling to the ground and struggling more intense. The loud uproar around was like a wave, and it seemed that the whole world had become a mess. Knight Murray's second punch was blocked by the opponent's raised left hand, but it was just passive defense. Then the third punch, the fourth punch. Although the middle-aged knight was exhausted, he gritted his teeth and burst out a fierce force at this moment. The sound of steel and flesh colliding continued to play, and teeth broke, and dull screams were born continuously. The surviving Knight Owen on the other side of the field was watching all this with excitement, but he didn't notice that the white-robed figure behind him had quietly stopped breathing. Alman, one of the twins who was lying on the ground next to him, was crawling towards that side, as if he wanted to go over and stab his brother a few more times, but he was moving slowly because of his injuries. Queen Visanina, who was in the audience on one side of the grassland, had stood up and yelled something over here, but her voice was drowned in the huge sound waves and was not noticeable at all. It's time. Sister Ada, who was drowned in the audience, glanced at the figure who stood up and yelled excitedly on the judgment seat opposite. A trace of pain flashed in her eyes, but more of it was pleasure. The boy vaguely heard the person next to him say this, but thought it was about the victory result, so he didn't care. Instead, he was still immersed in the joy of the knight beating his usurper uncle on the field, jumping and cheering like the people around him. The mute girl beside him sat there obediently. Compared with the others, she seemed to be the quietest one. Her golden eyes kept looking at the blonde holding the enemy's legs in the field, with a thoughtful expression. But then she seemed to feel something. Her face was stunned, and then she lied, hesitating and saying some random syllables to the boy beside her, but she was completely drowned in the noise around her, so she stood up and ran along the aisle to the field. The boy didn't hear her voice, but saw her back standing up and running out, so he raised his hand and tried to pull her, but he didn't pull her. Then he stood up and prepared to chase her, but a strong hand grabbed him instead. "Don't worry about her, She's not afraid of fire. A hoarse voice sounded. What are you talking about? The boy looked at the very strange Sister Ada beside him in confusion. The other party didn't answer, but smiled and raised her slightly wrinkled hand and touched the boy's bald head. What do you think this rebellious kingdom needs, kid? It needs a wise king. The boy answered smoothly, then struggled hard, but found that his strength was not as great as the old man next to him. No. Sister Ada ignored the boy's impatient expression and said to him seriously, it's blood and fire. Thank you Heath Ice-T and Antarctic researcher for the 1000 rewards. Thank you Ouroboros and Kylan Virus for the 500 rewards. Thank you Cat Eats That Flower for the 200 rewards. Thank you Cyanatang 246. Use Raw Milk. Otaku Upstairs. Huan Daoyan. Saber 3,276,421. And 201908140342257990 for the 100 rewards. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116 The Trial of the Seven Sons. Blood and Fire. Blood and fire is the family motto of the Targaryen family. Although the boy could not hear it clearly because of the noise around him, he was still very familiar with the pronunciation of this sentence, so his expression was stunned after hearing it. We conquered Westeros with 3 dragons, and now we have 13. Sister Ada looked down at the boy with a strange expression. In her slightly turbid blue eyes, there was a deep hatred and the pleasure of revenge. In the future, we may have 23, 33, or even 133. She was talking to herself, rather than talking to the boy. Your brother was assassinated, your father was forced to return to Dragonstone, and the whole kingdom was laughing at him. I can tolerate this, but I don't want to pay attention to it. After all, Inez is too soft. But Visenya, how can Visenya be so cruel? She will pay the price. Yes, everyone will pay the price, and today is just the starting point. What are you talking about? The boy stared at the other party in surprise and asked, with a vague premonition of something bad. I said, the show is about to begin. The nun replied softly. Successfully completed the Seven Sons trial mission. You have obtained the characteristic, Son of a Warrior. With sweat dripping and panting intensifying, Nightmare's fists repeatedly hit the struggling black armored enemy under him, and his iron fingers with lobster gauntlets were stained with blood. However, even though the enemy's face was blurred after being beaten, he was not completely dead, but struggled very fiercely. However, this fierceness did not last long, before he lost all his strength. Nightmare punched a few more times out of worry, and finally collapsed to the ground and laughed loudly. Captain Nancy, who had been suppressing the enemy's right hand, also lay there and laughed foolishly, with sweat dripping from her forehead onto the grass. The enemy's final struggle was very strong, and it was unclear why he could burst out with such great strength. Even Renly, who had bound his legs, was exhausted at this moment. After seeing that the enemy was no longer moving, he completely relaxed while lying on his back hugging his legs. He turned over and lay on his back on the grass, gasping for breath. The sunlight in the sky was so strong that it was blinding, and the surrounding environment was filled with countless noises. It was the shouting of the onlookers from all directions. They were extremely excited about everything on the field. The difference was that some were angry and some were excited. Soldiers rushed to the entrance of the competition venue, but were blocked by a group of warrior sons. From the corner of his eye, he could see that they seemed to have a conflict. On the judgment seat in another direction, the brown-robed Archbishop of the Sanctuary of Thought sat in his original position, while the old lady next to him stood up and shouted at him, but the distance was too far, and he couldn't hear her words clearly. She might have admitted defeat, otherwise there would be no information emerging, but Renly didn't think much about the information that had just been born, and the meaning behind it. At this moment, he was panting with fatigue, and there were still bursts of stabbing pain in his heart. His brain instinctively wanted to empty his mind, wanted to lie down and rest, and didn't want to think about anything else. Unfortunately, his rest was interrupted after a while. when his eyes, which had replaced the original light blue color, were looking up at the sky blankly, he suddenly heard footsteps beside him, and then he felt someone kneeling beside him. Just as he was about to turn his head to look, a shaking force suddenly made his chest feel stuffy, and then he couldn't help coughing. Why are you here? Renly wanted to curse, but when he turned his head, he found that the person shaking him was Rhea, a girl in a white robe, so his words turned into a surprised question. Unfortunately, this person was obviously unable to answer his question, and now she was pulling his arm with an anxious look on her face, trying to make him stand up. This expression startled Renly, who was in astonishment. He then stood up without hesitation, ignoring his lack of strength. He gritted his teeth and stood up with the help of the other party. He was about to ask the two collapsed companions 1 meter away to stand up, but a cool feeling that blocked the sun suddenly came, and a shadow of a beast appeared on the ground under his feet, and it grew rapidly. Renly's heart skipped a beat, and he looked up unconsciously. He saw a dragon. A giant dragon with dark yellow scales and wings spread out, as if covering the sky. The dragon swooped down from the sky behind the arena, appearing silently, so that when people discovered it, it had already arrived above the arena. The whole environment suddenly became quiet, and then people screamed in panic, like a tsunami, one wave higher than the other. Chaos suddenly appeared. Women, children, old people, monks, and even bishops, all of them hurriedly ran to the exit of the auditorium. Some civilians standing on both sides turned around and ran without hesitation. Looking down from a high place, the entire arena was like a high-rise building that was suddenly blown up. Countless rubble and dust collapsed and poured in all directions, causing ripples. In the arena, covered with green grass, there was no need for Renly to remind them. The two warrior sons lying on the ground had already hurriedly climbed up, and the smiles on their faces had long disappeared. Captain Nancy cursed while climbing. You used dragons. After losing the tournament, the Targaryens deserve to go to the 7 levels of hell. A bunch of bitch-raised bastards. He didn't care about his image as a captain at this time. The way he cursed made him look like a fearless little gangster, but his expression was a little desperate. But after he climbed up, he didn't run away directly, but ran towards Night Owen, who had broken his legs not far away. Night Murray also ran towards the surviving brown-haired twins who were closer, and at the same time, shouted to Renly without looking back, "Protect the girl first." In fact, he didn't need to say it. Renly had already dragged the panicked girl to the corner of the arena. Unfortunately, after a few steps, the dragon suddenly swooped down on him. The loud and angry roar was accompanied by a dark red dragon flame. At the critical moment, Renly suddenly hugged Rhea and fell to the ground. The heat wave came from the sky, and a few strands of hair seemed to be scorched, and even a burnt smell emerged. But fortunately, the angle was so that the whole person was not burned by the dragon flame. The two people lying on the ground barely avoided the swooping fire, but some people behind them were not so lucky. The running Night Murray reacted quickly and jumped to the side, barely avoiding the dragon flame. But the brown-haired figure not far away and Captain Nancy, who had not yet run to where Night Owen was, only had time to roar before they were completely engulfed by the flames. The heat wave surged, watching the horrible sea of fire falling from the sky in the distance and the hazy struggling figures in it. The broken-legged Night Owen's eyes were bloodshot. Then he looked at the two surviving companions behind the dragon flame, gritted his teeth, picked up the long sword beside him, and threw it at the dark yellow dragon that was leaning over, roaring and shouting, "Monster, come to me." Unfortunately, his sword did not hit the target, and the dragon ignored him, but turned in the sky and rushed back to the way it came. "Go to hell, you monster." At this time, Renly had just climbed up, and a familiar voice suddenly appeared from the side and back. He couldn't help but look back. Night Murray was struggling to pull a spear picked up from the ground in his hand, and threw it at the dragon that was diving into the sky. Unlike Night Owen, his spear hit the belly of the dragon flying low, but it did not cause any damage. "Take the girl away from here." After shouting desperately at Renly, Night Murray, holding a shield, stepped back and turned to run. Unfortunately, the giant dragon in the sky just sneezed, and a dark red flame directly wrapped around the fleeing figure, and even the desperate and angry roar became hoarse and dull. The tall figure wrapped in flames struggled and collapsed at the edge of the audience, and the twitching gradually weakened. Then the dragon turned in the sky again. A pair of dark red eyes glowed with cold and violent colors in the sun, and the huge body swooped towards Renly. Chapter 117 The Trial of the Seven Suns. The giant dragon with dark yellow scales rushed over at high speed, still without making any roar, but the wind wrapped by its wings was quite violent. For some reason, it seemed that it was only interested in the 7 knights in the judgment field, or in other words, it was only interested in the 3 people who participated in killing Mika, so that no matter the large number of people fleeing in panic around it, or the Night Owen who was shouting in anger over there, they did not attract its attention. In the chaotic scene, Renly, who noticed this, looked at the girl who was dragging him with concern, then broke free from the other's palm and ran quickly in another direction. Unfortunately, his speed could not match the pursuit of the dragon. After a while, a gust of wind came from behind him. Renly, who felt that his death was imminent, sighed and then stood at the edge of the grass without resistance. However, after several seconds, there was no burning sensation behind him. Instead, there was a roar of heavy objects falling to the ground. He could not help but turn his head to see a petite and thin figure with his arms wide open blocking him. The earthy yellow dragon covered with spikes had already landed on the ground, tilting its head, staring at the thin figure in white with its deep dark red eyes. Its violent emotions seemed to have eased, and it did not attack again. This situation made Renly stunned, and then he thought of something unconsciously, but he did not have time to think about it, because when he turned around, he clearly saw that the dragon immediately looked at him over Rhea, and at the same time, the violent eyes that had originally calmed down grew again, bloodshot, and the slightly opened dragon mouth began to flicker with fire. Obviously, Rhea could no longer stop it. Upon discovering this, Renly gritted his teeth and ran in another direction, and the dragon turned its neck to face the direction he was running, with its mouth wide open. Seeing the dragon's neck change position, the thin figure in white hurriedly ran a few steps with her arms outstretched and stood in front of Renly again. She didn't show any expression, but her back looked extremely stubborn. However, Renly couldn't let the girl stand in front of him. Seeing that the dragon had already opened its bright mouth and was ready to spit out dragon flames, he suddenly threw the other party to the ground. Renly wanted to imitate the action of dodging the dragon flames before, but unfortunately this time the dragon stood on the ground. Because of the angle, the dark red surging sea of fire did not spray vertically, but it also poured on the broad back of the blonde figure like violent boiling water. The silver mail made of countless rings quickly became hot and red. The muffled screams that could not be suppressed made the thin body blocked below struggle desperately, and waves of anxious screams were born. The screams were extremely harsh. The dragon that was spewing dragon flames seemed to be stimulated by something. It suddenly restrained its breath and hissed, turned around and ran away, as if it had sensed the breath of some flood beast. However, there was nothing unusual at the place, except for a tall figure whose mail armor on his back melted and mixed with flesh and blood, and whose wounds glowed whitely. The white light seemed to glow from his flesh and blood, as if it had a healing effect, but the effect seemed very weak and kept flickering, and the horrible injury did not seem to improve much. The thin girl who was pressed under him had her robe burned away at her calves, revealing a pair of slender but intact legs, which clearly proved that the protection made of her body was not strong. However, the tall figure whose thoughts became extremely blurred due to the pain, had no spare energy to think about this problem. His internal organs seemed to be burned, and he was on the verge of breaking. A patch of hair on the back of his head was burned away by sparks, but most of the front looked intact. The girl under him looked anxious. In the cramped space, she raised her chin and looked up at the face that was drooping to the ground. She pulled out the arm that was supporting her chest with great effort and carefully waved her hand in front of the other's beautiful eyes while mumbling something. "What are you talking about?" The confused murmur was weak and could not be heard by the other party at all, but the trembling lips made Leia happy, thinking that he was fine. But then her expression froze, because after that sentence, the ice blue in the other's eyes quietly faded and slowly turned into a dead green. The girl was stunned. The situation outside did not stop because of this. Without her scream, the dragon that was scared away before turned back from the sky again, which made some warrior sons who were careful to approach the edge of the arena hurriedly avoid it, and a crying voice came from the empty audience seats. "Did you do it? Make it stop. Please." The bold boy Ego was pulling the old nun sitting next to him and begging. The other party shook her head and responded, "It can't be stopped, child. Unless revenge is completed, no one can stop it." As she said, the dragon had already landed on the grass and crawled towards the target. Sister Ada looked at the charred body blocking the girl from a distance, and then looked at the intact girl below it, and sighed with a melancholy expression. "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to put the blame on Visenya. If you want to blame someone, blame him for getting involved in this trial. He has only been a knight for a short time. Why did he have to show off? What a stupid man." The nun stopped talking before she finished, because she suddenly found that the charred figure suddenly turned into dust and collapsed into the air, which made her pupils shrink suddenly. Many details that she had noticed but didn't care about quickly emerged in her mind, filled with hatred. Her face was uncertain, and her eyes couldn't help but look at the boy next to her. But before she could ask anything, she suddenly felt a special breath coming from the venue. Looking closely, the girl covered in dust was still lying on the grass, looking blankly at the sky. Her calves were exposed, and the robe on her upper body was wrinkled and burnt, but her whole body seemed to become very hazy. This haziness made her look a little unreal, as if she had become a reflection in the water, and the surrounding space turned into a lake. As the reflection swayed faintly, waves of invisible ripples spread out from it, so that the grassy ground shook faintly, and the light from the sun in the sky was constantly expelled, or absorbed. The invisible ripples spread in all directions. The dragon on the green grass not far away noticed this, so it turned around and ran away in a hurry, but it was not faster than the ripples. It even screamed, and suddenly turned into a big-headed dragon with leaf wings, and fell from the sky. The Owen Knight, whose face was dull and dead in the arena, was affected by the ripples, and his golden hair quickly turned white. A group of warrior sons in the corner were full of horror, but they suddenly shrank inward, and eventually turned into a group of palm-sized pocket knights who looked at each other in bewilderment, and some of them even turned into women. The empty auditorium creaked as it was swept by the ripples. The wooden railings in one area began to turn black and crack, but on the surface of another area, tender green branches sprouted and grew rapidly. A crack suddenly appeared somewhere in the trembling ground, and the green grass began to collapse and shrink inward, as if a large amount of soil was swallowed up by an endless black hole. Sister Ada in the audience didn't know what was going on, but she pulled the boy up and ran without hesitation. However, she had only taken a few steps when a whisper-like chuckle suddenly sounded from behind. The laughter was familiar and strange. "Thank you Uncle 1009 for the 14,000 reward. Thank you to the Dutch friend Fixiang for the reward of 1000 yuan. Thank you to the book friends Xianatang 246, Kindayan, Beechin Yuxing, Sanal, 160,212,182,018,889 and 201908140342257990 for the reward of 100 yuan. Chapter 118 Chaos Mark. The surging impact was accompanied by a sharp pain like hell coming from the back that spread throughout the body. The feeling made him wish he could faint, but under the influence of another special invisible force, his mind was able to remain clear, or in other words, he was able to not lose himself in the instincts of his body and still carry out his purpose. This situation was torture, and every second passed very long, and it was simply worse than death. It was not until the impact from the back ended that the inexplicable force quietly faded away. The severe pain from the back made his tortured will instantly blurred, and finally fell into complete darkness. In a trance, Renly seemed to have returned to his original body. There was no longer the despairing heat around him, but a piece of softness wrapped in a smooth substance. The smell in his nose was not the smell of burnt meat and the smell of grass, but a faint fruit fragrance, apples, strawberries, blood oranges from dawn. The pleasant smell was accompanied by the faint sound of conversation and footsteps. The comfortable environment wrapped around him from head to toe. The severe pain in his back was only a piece of illusion left in his heart, and the vitality of his whole body gradually returned to normal. but Renly was still immersed in the dimness of his mind, drifting in a daze. The lingering pain made his mind still sluggish, and he ignored the external situation. It may have been a long time, or it may have been just a moment. The emergence of two pieces of information made his tightly closed eyes suddenly open, and his mind recovered. His cold ice blue eyes stared at the velvet curtain above the bed, his expression full of disbelief. Successfully guided the child of chaos to the right path. You obtained a chaos mark. You completed all events. You obtained the characteristic, psychic heart. Finished. He murmured. His face was not full of joy, but full of daze. How could it be completed? She hasn't changed her habit of stealing things, and she still likes to play with fire. She hasn't learned many words. How could it be completed? This question made him doubtful. After careful recollection, the last impression in his mind was the back of the other party bravely blocking in front of him. Renly reluctantly thought that it might be that his death stimulated her, and then she changed her mind and remembered his previous teachings completely. But for some reason, he always felt uneasy in his heart. There was a special burning sensation on the wrist of his left hand. He raised it to his eyes and looked at it. On the skin, where it met the palm, the two black and white arcs that seemed to be composed of simple lines crossed in reverse made him feel faintly dizzy. Renly frowned unconsciously. The thing in front of him should be the chaos mark. It looks like a tattoo. He looked at it carefully, but he didn't see any explanation or anything unusual. Apart from the special dizziness, it seemed useless. His confusion was mixed with strong regret, anger, and uneasiness, and he was also nostalgic for that world. So after observing it blankly for a while, he suddenly took out a dagger from under the soft pillow and held it tightly, regardless of his hungry stomach. Unfortunately, after squeezing it for a long time, the dagger and he didn't have any reaction, proving that the fragrance of this thing that had dissipated for the most part could not support him to enter that special world. After staring blankly for a while, Renly put the dagger back in place, then stepped on the soft light green meat carpet, walked to the balcony of the exquisite room, and sat on the table and chairs. It was just getting light outside, and beyond the balcony, beyond the battlements of the castle, there was a coastline with a few ships moored. Looking out, a bright sun at the end of the ocean slowly emits dazzling light, covering the dark blue and grey sea level with brilliant light. The closed windows isolate all the noises from the outside world, but the sensitive ears can still hear the faint sound of the tide and various trivial noises in the castle. Looking at the situation outside motionlessly, Renly did not think of other ideas for a moment, just wanted to let his mind empty and immerse himself in the afterglow of another world. But after a while, there was a sudden knock on the door behind him. Lord Renly, His Majesty Robert invites you to breakfast. The maid repeats this sentence every morning, but it sounds quite unfamiliar now. I don't want to eat breakfast, Renly responded, his voice full of fatigue. Please tell my brother that I ate a few fruits this morning and am full. The maid's voice was worried after hearing this. Are you sick again, my lord? What does it mean to be sick again? Renly frowned upon hearing this, but it also lifted his spirits a little. After taking a deep breath, he raised his voice and said, I just don't want to get up. I haven't woken up yet, but you said I was full. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, sir, I understand. The maid understood, and then left with a tapping sound. However, before Renly could rest, another voice came out soon. Lord Renly, I brought the clothes you need to wear for tomorrow's wedding. Please open the door. I need you to try them on yourself. The word wedding made Renly startled, and then he suddenly realized that only 1 night and half a day had passed, and tomorrow was the wedding day of his cheap brother. This made him feel absurd and impatient inexplicably, but he was also disturbed by this kind of interruption, and no longer had that kind of melancholy mentality. After sighing, the black-haired boy slid down the chair, walked to the door and opened it. What came into view was a tall, thin old man with a well-dressed mustache, a black-haired maid, and 2 guards guarding the door. The old man was the royal tailor, and the maid was responsible for dressing Renly. After entering the house, they were busy in front of the fitting mirror, and finally nodded with satisfaction. The boy in the mirror had short shiny black hair, a fair and delicate face, and stunning eyes that set off his neat dark green velvet clothes with gold edges. He looked like a little prince who walked out of a story, but his overall temperament seemed melancholy and dull. "This suit fits me well, sir, but the yellow lining of the cuffs doesn't match your appearance, so please take it off first. I need to adjust it again." The old tailor's attitude seemed very serious, and Renly nodded absent-mindedly when he heard it. His main concern was not what to wear, but the misty words that appeared in the mirror in front of him. Racial level, LV2, profession, bard, beginner, knight, beginner, professional characteristics, sensitive to rhythm, singing spirit, knowledge, heraldry LV7, swimming LV7, archery LV5, knowledge, poison making LV5, dagger mastery LV5, fishing LV2. Derived characteristics, psychic emblem, Valyrian bloodline, mutated, curse of embers, warrior's son, psychic heart. The results of several months of training are hidden behind the knight profession. As long as Renly looks at it intently, these misty words will change into another line. Riding LV6, lance mastery LV4, swordsmanship LV4, shield mastery LV4, spear mastery LV2. The bard profession is the same, except at the profession level. He then stared at the 3 new characteristics in the attribute column. Spirit and the singing. Whenever you do something in line with the spirit of chivalry in front of others, your combat ability and physical fitness will be blessed by the power of faith. Son of the warrior. In battle, you will receive the blessing of the warrior, one of the 7 aspects of God, and will not be affected by pain. At the same time, your wishes and requests will be more likely to receive his feedback. Psychic heart. When there are living beings who strongly desire to communicate with you, you can vaguely hear their voices. Chapter 119 Backtalk. The atmosphere in this small bedroom in Meagher's tower was extremely quiet. The 2 boys on the balcony were staring down at the window. They didn't say anything for a long time, and their expressions were all as if they were scared. They finally looked at each other. "Why did the chicken leg you brought move?" the black-haired boy asked the other first. This made the blonde boy, who was already shocked, even more confused. He answered stupidly, "I don't know. It's cooked. But why did it move? Is this castle really haunted?" Renly said thoughtfully. Tyrion couldn't help but feel nervous when he heard this. He couldn't wait to look out the window and stuttered, "Should we call the guards? It's better this way." Renly nodded, his face serious, "But I don't think they will believe what we saw." Tyrion nodded in agreement, his face pale. Then he sat back in his original seat and became a little restless, his eyes always glancing at the remaining half-roasted capon in front of Renly. His expression seemed full of fear, but there was also curiosity brewing in his eyes. In this situation, Renly didn't want to eat anything more, so he moved the stool under him back a few steps, pointed at the food on the table and said, "This chicken is strange. I think we need to send it to Mr. Purcell. Maybe he can know why its legs are moving. I'll take it out." The blonde boy suddenly said, "Then I'll ask our Mr. Grand Mr. Purcell is busy with the wedding recently and won't be free." "Okay, but you have to be careful. Maybe the remaining half chicken will come back to life," Renly reminded kindly. Tyrion gritted his teeth and nodded, then stood up and trembled as he picked up the plates to say goodbye. At this moment, Renly suddenly thought of something, so when he walked him to the door, he said, "I hope the warrior will give you courage, Tyrion." The expression on the other's face became more serious, but his slightly trembling hand suddenly stabilized. After nodding vigorously at Renly, he hurriedly walked away along the corridor. Renly looked at the other's back thoughtfully, then shook his head and closed the door. Then his eyes looked at his left wrist. The roasted chicken leg just ran away, which seemed to be a very worthy point of study in the eyes of the little devil, but Renly couldn't help but suspect that it was his own fault. Because he used his left hand to grab the chicken leg at the time, and on this left hand, there was a tattoo called the Mark of Chaos. Chaos. Frowning and observing the mark on his wrist, Renly was not sure what this thing was. He raised his hand to touch the door and the wall, and nothing special happened. He was unconsciously in a trance. The girl's intimate smile was still vivid in his mind. Renly could no longer hold back some questions that he had not dared to think deeply about before. What exactly is the Son of Chaos? This question seemed like a fog. At first, Renly thought that this title meant that Rhea was related to him, and he was Chaos. Although there were many puzzles about this suspicion, it was barely justifiable. After all, according to the original history, his series of actions after entering the copy did lead that history to another track, which could be called chaos. Moreover, the girl involved seemed to be able to connect with him in terms of appearance and background. But now looking at his wrist, Renly suddenly stopped thinking so. What exactly is the son of chaos? Is it really his child? Or is it a creature formed by the convergence of some other forces that he could not understand? What does the meaning of the son of chaos mean? Chaos son, or the son of chaos? What does the so-called chaos represent? The extended question is, what exactly is the historical copy? Is it another parallel world? Or is it a past of the world in which you live? Simply being born from an egg was strange enough for Renly. Although he had comforted himself by saying that this was a fantasy world, the appearance of this mark, which did not exist in the system information, suddenly made him feel at a loss. This so-called reward contrasted with the tone of many rewards given before. The eggshells that swallowed insects, the similarity of appearance with Dornishman, the talent of knowing nothing but being able to learn words inexplicably. All kinds of inconspicuous but crucial clues emerged at this moment. Obviously, Rhea could not be just a freak born from an egg, and the girl who had a lot to do with dragons could not be just his daughter. So what is she? What is the so-called right path? What is she like now? Standing there thinking for a while with an uncertain face, he finally sighed, feeling that his thoughts were a mess. So he tried not to think about these things, but his eyes could not help but sweep to the books in the corner of the balcony. After a moment of stunned silence, the black-haired boy walked over, gathered it up, and put it back on the table, then sat on the chair on the balcony, looking at the castle and the sea outside the balcony, feeling familiar yet strange. Renly was in a bad mood, but not because of those problems. After experiencing reincarnation and traveling through dungeons, he had actually gotten used to not understanding many problems, and he didn't have the idea of having to figure it out. After all, he knew too little and couldn't figure it out by guessing blindly. He just regretted that he left in a hurry and didn't have time to say goodbye. The next time I saw Tyrion was on the morning of the second day after the chicken leg moving incident, which was the wedding day of Robert and Cersei. Because he entered the dungeon during the gap before his brother's wedding, and even as soon as he came out, Renly didn't have the slightest time to rest and relax, nor did he have much time to study his new abilities, but had to devote himself to various busy events. At this time, King's Landing was extremely noisy. The common people were talking about the wedding that was about to begin today, and the noble lords were busy wearing various decent dresses and clothes under the service of servants, and preparing their own gifts. The venue for His Majesty Robert's wedding was in the Cathedral of St. Bela on the top of Visenya Hill in the city, but on the eve of the wedding, a breakfast banquet was held in the Red Castle. The participants of the banquet were mainly the family members of the new Liwats and their respective lords and knights. At this juncture, they presented gifts to the king, including exquisite jewelry, gorgeous belts, gold spurs cast in pure gold, and various practical or impractical daggers. The new king was crowned not long ago, but his hobbies had long been widely circulated. Apart from drinking and having fun and fighting, Robert Baratheon especially liked to collect daggers, so the presence of this thing in the gifts seemed to be particularly large. Although Renly was young, he also wanted to send a gift. He originally thought that he could just find something random in his trash box and send it up. After all, no one would care what he sent. However, the palace steward had thought about this for him first, so the gift Renly sent became a pure gold cloak buckle, which was not very valuable, but not cheap either. However, sending gifts was not the only thing Renly had to do today. The middle-aged palace steward with a big nose kept nagging in his ear, constantly reminding the boy of his tasks in the upcoming wedding. In fact, it was nothing, just holding the cloak for the cheap brother and scattering flowers for the new Liwats. But even if it was so simple, the royal butler still seemed to be uneasy, which made Renly quite impatient. So when he saw Tyrion mixed in a group of blonde Lannisters, he suddenly walked towards him, ignoring the nagging butler behind him who treated him like a 3-year-old child. "Good morning, Tyrion." He approached and greeted the other party. The ugly boy in a well-dressed suit also returned the greeting in a formal manner. After negotiating with a blonde man holding his hand, he and Renly ran to the corner of the breakfast banquet. I don't know why, this little devil of the Lannister family seems to be a little depressed. Renly asked curiously, so he glanced at Lord Tywin, who was talking to his majesty the king not far away, and whispered, "Father took the chicken to feed the dog." His tone was gloomy. Why? Because he said that the way I saw the chicken was like a beggar seeing a gold dragon. Didn't you send the chicken to your maester? Renly asked strangely. I wanted to send it, but then I wanted to see if it would come back to life, so I didn't. Tyrion said, as if he was afraid that Renly would blame him for not keeping his word, so he changed the subject and said, then my father found out, and then I argued with him a few times. It seemed that the last chicken leg incident had brought them closer together. The little guy in front of him looked a little more cheerful, but also quite depressed. As he spoke, he glanced at his bald middle-aged Duke father again, obviously still frightened by some of the situations he had faced before. Seeing his cowardly look, Renly found it hard to believe that he would argue with his elders, which made him unconsciously think of what he said to the other party when they parted yesterday, so he couldn't help asking, why did you argue? Was what he said too much? Not too much. The other party hesitated and said, father just wanted me to throw away the chicken. I didn't want to, so he ordered me to do it, and then I didn't want to argue back, but I just couldn't help it. Chapter 120 Wedding. The crowd that came for the wedding was like an ocean in the night, filling the magnificent church hall. Compared with them, the breakfast meeting in the morning was just an appetizer. At this time, Renly was standing under the statue of the god in the center of the hall, holding a heavy golden cloak in his hand, performing the exclusive task of being the king's younger brother. In front of him were the two parties to the marriage, the black-haired king wearing a golden and black silk coat and a velvet cloak, and the slender golden curly-haired girl wearing a scarlet silk dress. The two were standing in front of the statue of the father and the mother in the depths of the church, receiving the blessing of the archbishop of the church. The fat archbishop wore a huge crown made of gold foil and crystal. The sun shone in from the high window behind him. The crystal crown continued to emit colorful rainbow light as the archbishop's big head swayed slightly. The words he spoke echoed in the sea of people without even a cough, which seemed particularly sacred. Renly focused on his thick, intestine-like lips opening and closing. He seemed very serious, but in fact his thoughts had already diverged. A discovery at the breakfast meeting suddenly aroused his interest in the church, or the gods behind the church. The result of a single experiment was not very convincing, but the system had already explained it. Since the warrior's son feature could allow him to get a response from the warriors, does it mean that the gods of this world must exist? If so, in what form do they exist? And what is the relationship with the historical copies he traveled through? The features obtained in the historical copies can now be responded to in reality. Does this prove that history and reality are actually the same world? Or are the so-called gods just some kind of program machinery, and as long as Renly has a special power, the prayers he speaks out can be responded to? This feature itself does not seem to have much effect, and it seems to have a duration, but the meaning behind it makes Renly ponder it. However, the schedule is tight, and he faces many busy things. As soon as he comes out, Renly has no time to experiment this carefully for the time being. To what extent can it do? Can it satisfy all wishes? Or is it limited to warriors? How long does it last? As long as you say it, it will respond. The ceremony is very cumbersome. Because the church's god is seven-faceted, the number 7 is very important in Westeros, and has long been infiltrated into customs, laws, daily life, etc. Therefore, the new Liwats in front of them not only have to make 7 vows, but also receive 7 blessings and exchange 7 promises. After a series of procedures, Renly thought about a lot of questions, and his arms dragging the cloak were a little sore, but when the wedding hymn sang by the choir sounded around him, he immediately perked up. Do the people watching the ceremony have doubts about the legitimacy of the marriage of the new Liwats in front of you? The majestic voice of the archbishop spread throughout the church and echoed. This kind of questioning is an inherent procedure of the wedding ceremony. Under normal circumstances, no one will stand up to make trouble, and there is no accident at the moment. So the next cloak exchange ceremony, which represents marrying into the husband's family, officially began. The majestic Duke Tywin Lannister stepped forward to take off the cloak that his daughter was originally wearing, and Renly, as the younger brother, stepped closer in neat steps and presented the heavy golden cloak in his hands to his cheap elder brother. The other party took the cloak and shook it off, wrapped it around the bride, and tied it for her personally. After the bride and Robert kissed deeply, the High Septon made a declaration. Here, in the presence of the gods and the world, he said loudly, I solemnly declare that Robert of the Baratheon family and Cersei of the Lannister family are married. From now on, they are one body, one mind, and one soul, forever. Anyone who interferes with their marriage will be ruthlessly cursed. After speaking, many nobles who watched the ceremony applauded, and the wedding ceremony officially ended. However, the end of the ceremony does not mean that the wedding is over. There are still a series of procedures to go through, such as the new Liwat standing outside under the statue of Saint Bela to accept the blessings of the people and nobles, and holding a wedding dinner in the evening, and finally making trouble in the bridal chamber. Renly served as a page boy and a flower scattering boy during this process. He felt that this task was somewhat boring, and he was also worried that, while he was scattering flowers, the flowers in his hand would suddenly come alive, or something else. Fortunately, nothing happened until the mission was over, and he got on the carriage back to the Red Castle. Your mission is basically completed. Some noble ladies will invite you to dance at the banquet tonight. Before that, go back and practice to avoid making a fool of yourself. A faint voice echoed in the carriage. Stannis, dressed in a golden and black costume, was admonishing his absent-minded brother. Are you sure? Renly glanced at his cheap second brother who spoke harshly. I'm so small, how can I dance with others? He wanted to say that others would have to bend over and jump around. But the other party obviously had no intention of answering this question, and instead said to himself, no matter what other time, you must attend breakfast tomorrow. Don't make excuses, like you did yesterday. This is polite, otherwise the new queen will have an opinion on you. It was normal to hear this from someone else, but it was a bit strange for Renly to hear it from this person, because in his impression, this cheap second brother has always had no emotional intelligence to speak of. After the wedding, Mace Tyrell will prepare to leave King's Landing, and you will go to the River Reach with him. Looking at the boy with a dazed face, Stannis said, I'm against sending you to be an adopted son, but Robert insists on doing so. He is the king now, and I can't quarrel with him. Renly nodded, thinking that there should be more to follow this sentence, such as some instructions, so he pretended to listen attentively. But after the other party finished speaking, he stopped talking, but sat there quietly looking at the boy, looking outside the carriage from time to time, occasionally with a thoughtful expression, and it was unclear what he was thinking. Renly was speechless about this, but he was used to this weirdo, so he didn't take it seriously, and focused on his own affairs. About the present, about the past, and even more about the future. The banquet will not start until tonight, and there is nothing he needs to do in the meantime. After the carriage returned to the Red Keep, Renly was sent back to Meagher's Holdfast. But before he walked into his little room, he suddenly saw someone who shouldn't be here, the weird swamplander whose dagger he stolen. Thank you for the 2000 reward from the book friend Don't Annoying, and thank you for the 100 reward from the book friend Xianatang 246, the book friend Lu Ren 2 Feripang and the book friend Yun Shang 1992. Chapter 121 The Lost Eggshell. Howland Reed, the cranberry man, was short and thin, wearing a grey inconspicuous robe. He looked quite ordinary, the kind of person who would not be noticed at first glance in the crowd, but Renly had to pay attention to him. Not only because he had stolen his dagger, but also because he seemed to be an unusual person. When he saw the cranberry man, he was walking in the corridor of Meagher's Holdfast under the guidance of a servant. When he saw him suddenly, Renly subconsciously thought that there was some special magic mark on the dagger, and this person followed the mark to find him. However, despite thinking so, he approached and greeted him without any abnormality. Long time no see, Lord Howland. Hello, Lord Renly. The other party returned the greeting, and his expression did not seem to be unusual, which made Renly secretly relieved. Then he asked curiously, why are you here, sir? This question is very normal, because only certain people can enter Meagher's Holdfast, such as royal children and relatives of the Lannister family. I have some knowledge of architecture, and His Majesty Robert invited me to inspect the Red Keep and help customize the renovation plan. This person answered, and the Red Keep servant beside him nodded. Renly said oh, and was completely relieved. So he lost interest and said, then you go ahead, sir. I have to go back and rest first, and I have to attend the banquet in the evening. He was about to leave when the other party suddenly stopped him, and then asked under Renly's strange gaze, Lord Renly, I heard that you have a black cat? Yes. Renly nodded. Everyone in the Red Keep knew about this matter, because this black cat was quite famous in the Red Keep, and after Renly's summoning of peace the news also caused a lot of discussion among bored people. Later, the twins of the Red Wine family foolishly ran to the throne room and asked Robert, who was not yet king, for the cat. As a result, they were laughed at by many nobles who were listening. The two little fools were so embarrassed that they gave up. The cat became more famous. Can I see the cat? Seeing him nod, the swamp man hurriedly said, it's very important to me. What's so important about a cat? Renly asked curiously. Although he knew that the cat was very unusual, he couldn't imagine how the cat could be related to the swamp man. The cat may be a special species that has disappeared for a long time. The swamp man answered seriously, and I usually like to study the animal species in Westeros, and I hope to observe it up close. You can fool a 3-year-old child with this. Renly curled his lips secretly, but on the surface he said regretfully, it sounds interesting, but it's a pity that I haven't seen the cat for several days. It disappeared? The swamp man frowned. I guess so, or it may have run away to some corner. Renly said, the cat was originally a wild cat. Stannis said that wild cats are never tamed, so I'm not surprised that it ran away. The other party was a little disappointed, but he didn't bother to argue. Instead, he sighed and said goodbye to him politely. Turning his head to watch his back as he left, Renly touched his chin thoughtfully. He didn't lie. Since he left the dungeon, the cat has been missing, and no one knows where it ran away. Renly felt very sorry about this, because it was indeed a very special cat, and it would be a pity to lose it. But no matter how special it is, why did this marshland look for it? Because of a skin changer? In many folktales, the North is home to special beings called skin changers who can possess animals. Renly had long suspected that the black cat was possessed by a skin changer, which was why it was so smart. He made a random guess in his mind, but it was impossible to figure out the specific situation, and this question was not important among his many questions, so Renly stopped paying attention to it and prepared to continue on his way. As a result, when he turned around, he suddenly saw two sneaky boys looking over at this side at the corner of the open-air corridor. This made Renly suddenly suspect that his cat was caught by these two naughty kids, so without hesitation, he walked towards them quickly with the two guards behind him. The twins with strange orange hair were startled by this, and seemed to have not expected that they would be discovered. They quickly retracted their heads to avoid it, but unfortunately Renly had already identified them, so even if the two guys ran back to their rooms, they could not escape Renly's questioning. Did you steal my cat? After knocking on the door, there was a question. The two ugly faces that popped out from behind the door looked at each other and answered in unison, we didn't steal your cat. Then why did you run away when you saw me? Renly asked in disbelief. You look scary. The tall and strong boy answered carefully, while the short and thin boy said the opposite. If I don't run, do I have to call you an adult? We don't want to call you that. What a ridiculous reason. Renly frowned, a little unconvinced, but it didn't seem like the two guys were lying, so he repeated the question. You really didn't steal my cat? Only thieves steal things. The short twin said confidently, if we have to do something, we will rob, not steal. As soon as the words fell, the big one poked his brother next to him and whispered in a very subtle voice, don't say that. This guy is the Lord of Dragonstone now. We can't rob randomly. What are you afraid of? Our father is still the Lord of the Arbor. The short one retorted in a low voice, but then changed the subject and looked at Renly and said, I heard that you are going to Highgarden to be my grandmother's adopted son. Then we will be a family in the future, and we should be closer, so I don't blame you for wrongly accusing us. Do you want to play with us? I don't want to play with idiots. Renly answered seriously, especially two idiots who are ugly and stupid, and look exactly the same. The short man's face darkened at this remark. He glared at the guy in front of him with gritted teeth and seemed ready to roll up his sleeves to fight. The big man next to him snorted and said indignantly, "You are so pretty, but you are a nasty guy." After that, he closed the door tightly, which was considered to be a relief for his brother, who pretended to fight, but did not move at all. Renly did not care about being rejected. He relied on his sensitive ears to listen to some noises inside and began to frown and think. They seemed to have nothing to do with the disappearance of the black cat. So where did his cat go? Originally, Renly did not take it too seriously, but today, when the Marshlander appeared, he thought it seemed important to find the cat. Unfortunately, there was no clue. Walking absent-mindedly on the way back to his residence, he met the little devil of the Lannister family and greeted him on the way. The other party looked at him a little strangely, which made Renly puzzled again. But he didn't pay much attention to it. After returning to the room and searching, he didn't find the cat hiding in any corner, nor did he find any relevant clues. Instead, Renly found that the things he lost were not limited to the cat. There were also a pile of eggshells. A pile of dragon eggshells that he had wrapped up and locked in a box because he thought they were unpalatable. Chapter 122, The Future of the Dwarfs. At the beginning of the wedding banquet in the evening, Renly was still thinking about the cat and the dragon eggshell. It was normal for the cat to disappear. After all, it was a moving creature, but the disappearance of the eggshell was a bit strange. Renly had locked the eggshell in his trash box before, and in order to prevent someone from opening it without his knowledge, he also learned a trick from his past memory and put a hair on the lock. In this way, if someone moved the lock, he would definitely find it. However, when he opened the box before, the hair was still there, but the eggshell inside was gone. How could that thing disappear under the triple protection of the lock, the hair, and the door he had locked upside down? Renly felt that this was a supernatural event, and in addition, the missing cat and the swamplanders who suddenly came to look for the cat also made him feel very strange. It was as if something had happened without his knowledge. So, what was it? With this question lingering in his mind, the absent-minded black-haired boy had already chopped the onion cheese pie in front of him into pieces with the dagger in his hand, but he didn't realize it. Even the ugly blonde boy sitting next to him, who had been ignoring him, looked at him deliberately, wanting to say something, but he didn't say anything several times. The vast throne room was crowded with people at this time. Long tables were distributed in all directions. Servants were busy carrying plates of dishes with different aromas. When the king stood up to toast, the nobles stood up and shouted in response. In the environment of clinking glasses, top singers from all over the 7 countries took turns to sing under the king's banquet table. The surrounding music was endless, and the flickering lights enveloped the 4 directions, and the atmosphere became more and more intense. The table where the king sat was under the shadow of the towering Iron Throne, long enough to seat all the direct members of both families of the marriage. At this time, Renly was sitting on a chair 3 seats away from the king. Next to him were 2 Lannisters. One was Tyrion, who was the same age as him, and the other was a blonde young man named Gillian. There was a lot of noise around, and the blonde young man on the left was talking quietly to Stannis next to him. With a smile on his face, it was hard to tell that he had actually been talking for a long time, but unfortunately the other party was always lukewarm. In the core area farther away, the young king was watching the male and female acrobatic performances in the open space in front of the table with great interest, and from time to time he talked to the people next to him. It seemed that some words like grease and interesting acrobatics floated into his ears. The Nilaiwat queen sitting next to him kept a dignified and elegant appearance with a smile on her face, and her every move made many people who were observing her openly or secretly admire her. Of course, due to some widely circulated news before, more people looked at the side of the king's long table, that is, a blonde figure in a white robe standing quietly guarding under the shadow of the Iron Throne, with different emotions in their eyes. The instigator didn't care about these special situations at the moment. He extended from the eggshell problem to Rhea, from the black cat problem to himself, and vaguely considered some things in the future. The environment at the banquet was quite noisy, but he encountered a lot of problems recently, and he couldn't help but fall into a trance. But after a while, this kind of thinking was quietly broken by the voice of the person next to him. "I'm very strange, Renly. The voice from the side seemed to have some complicated emotions: expectation, entanglement, loss, uneasiness. Renly turned his head to look, and the very famous little devil in his memory had his facial features tangled together at this time, looking very tangled. "What's strange?" he asked. "In the afternoon, you laughed at them for being ugly." The ugly boy's words surprised Renly a little, but he nodded. "Yes, what's wrong? You said you don't play with ugly and stupid people." The blonde boy stared at him and said, "But why do you play with me?" This made Renly a little confused. He didn't understand why this boy would ask such a question, but before he could speak, the other party said to himself, "I'm uglier than them, and I don't think I'm very smart. Besides, I'm ugly, and I'm also a deformed dwarf." As he said, his two color eyes carefully looked at Renly's facial expression at this time. "According to your performance when talking to those two guys, you should ignore people like me. Then why do you look like you don't look down on me at all? Is it because of my family? But it doesn't seem like it. Many people are very polite to me because of my family, but their eyes are not like yours. What's the reason?" This sensitive and fragile boy with wrinkled features was frowning and staring at Renly at this time, as if trying to think about a question that he didn't understand. "I thought about it all afternoon, but I still can't figure it out. Can you tell me why? So why are you entangled with such a problem?" Renly was secretly surprised, but he simply didn't understand many of his questions, so he stopped thinking about them for the time being. After thinking for a while, he said, "You are ugly, but I don't think you are stupid." His words made the boy scratch his head with a strange look on his face. "Do you think I'm smart?" "No." Renly shook his head, and under the other's stunned expression, he said, "I think you will be very smart in the future." This was basically the truth, but unfortunately the other party didn't understand what he said, and felt very confused after hearing it. Seeing this, Renly explained, "You like reading, and you can get into it. This is very important, because even those adults rarely like reading. Meesters like reading, too." Tyrion shook his head. "It's not an advantage. It's really no big deal to like reading." Renly replied, "But I think a boy who can take the initiative to read a book without being urged is still quite rare." As he turned around, he cut a piece of food with a dagger, not sure whether it was peacock meat or heron meat, and put it in his mouth, and said a little vaguely, "So back to the previous question, why do I treat you differently from others?" "Because I'm optimistic about your future. That's it?" The other party asked blankly. "Optimistic about the future of a dwarf. What else?" "What else?" Renly shrugged. "Be optimistic, Tyrion. You actually have many advantages, but you just don't know it yourself, or you know it, but still lack confidence. I guess it's because of your appearance, but I think a person's appearance cannot affect what kind of person he will become in the future. Only hard work and the direction of choice can do that." After he finished speaking, he ignored the other person's expression, lowered his head, and picked up a bowl of broth, and drank it up. However, when he saw something out of the corner of his eye, the boy paused in swallowing, and then squinted his eyes. It was a grey, moving chicken leg that rolled on the ground. Thank you to book friend Ban 10,086 for the 5,000 reward. Thank you to book friend Lurengia for the 1,000 reward. Thank you to book friend Mr. Safe for the 500 reward. Thank you to book friend Xianxizize and book friend Chang Shanhua for the 100 reward. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 123: The Dog Who Intruded into the Party. There seemed to be thousands of people participating in the banquet in the wide throne hall, but the long table under the iron throne at the innermost end could still clearly see most of the situation here. This was not only because the surface of this table was higher than other places in the hall, but also because there was a large enough open space in the center of the banquet hall. Some acrobats or singers took turns to perform in the open space, and soon many noblemen and women would jump in and dance. However, just as two short dwarfs dressed as clowns were performing a ridiculous dance here, a grey chicken leg suddenly rolled out from the dense tables and chairs, and fled in panic towards the depths of the hall. Following closely behind was a dog. It was a white-haired pet dog with long ears. Its ears jumped when it ran on its short limbs, and it barked at the same time, but the sound was drowned in the greater noise of the banquet environment, and seemed very weak. At the edge of the open space, a middle-aged nobleman who was sitting there and chatting with someone beside him was the first to notice the white dog running past him, and then he saw what it was chasing, and he was stunned on the spot. Several people who heard the noise and looked over also screamed in surprise. An old man with a crow emblem embroidered on his chest rubbed his eyes in disbelief and muttered in confusion, "What is that?" No one answered his question, because the running puppy had already rushed to the two clowns. One of them was a dwarf with ketchup on his face and dancing on one leg with a pig bladder in his hand. He was spinning around, but he was scratched by the dog and fell to the ground with a plop, uttering a cry of pain. Many viewers who didn't know what was going on thought it was an entertainment show prepared by the dwarfs and laughed loudly, but some people who found out the truth were either confused or terrified, or stunned. Duke Tyrell of the Reach, who was near the chief's seat, was originally chatting and laughing with the Duke of the North beside him, but suddenly saw a dusty thing jumping onto his table, and then it jumped into a bowl of bacon and mushroom soup on the table, and the boiling soup splashed all over Duke Tyrell. Although this situation would usually make him look gloomy, he swallowed his saliva unconsciously and stared blankly at the thing rolling in the soup bowl with an increasingly terrified look. But before he could shout out, the thing that should have been dead suddenly knocked over the soup bowl with a bang and rolled quickly to the side of the table. Eddard Stark, who was next to Duke Tyrell, was also shocked at this time, but he did not just watch, but held the dagger and quickly stabbed at it when the thing passed by, but the thing rolled around, as if it had eyes, and quickly flew away. The sound of plates colliding and screams rang out from the long table. The dark yellow chicken leg that had taken a bath finally rolled into the arms of Duke Tully of the Riverlands, and then fell to the ground and rolled away quickly, while the old man was frightened. Seeing this, the puppy wandering under their table immediately ran after it. Gods, what the hell is this thing? Under the table, on the table, in the open space, in the aisle. There were bursts of chickens and dogs jumping, accompanied by shouts and screams of fear. The throne room was in chaos at the moment. Even some people who didn't see the real situation were attracted to it. The increasingly panicked atmosphere made many people leave their seats in a hurry to avoid it, but many people also approached it. The young king, the chief, naturally would not ignore this. He stared at the dog and the chicken leg moving back and forth between the legs of the banquet crowd with wide eyes. The new queen beside him also covered her mouth with horror. Two little boys not far away stared at the familiar thing without blinking, and their thoughts were completely different from others. The farce was finally stopped by a foot. Stannis, who had left the table at some point, quietly walked to the path where the chicken leg was bouncing, and then took advantage of its unpreparedness and stepped on it. Feeling the waves of struggle coming from his feet that he should not have, he couldn't help but frown. However, before Stannis bent down to pick up the thing, he suddenly felt his feet loosen, and then he saw that the strange thing actually used the method of taking off its skin to break free from his stepping and quickly fled. However, the strange thing did not roll over a few times, and the little white dog, who was whimpering and staring at it, had already reacted quickly and pounced on it and couldn't wait to bite the thing in his mouth and chew it quickly. It seemed so impatient, as if it thought this was some kind of delicacy. The chicken leg kept struggling in its mouth and front paws, but it could not get out. In the end, the dog ate it up quickly, leaving not even a bone. The noisy banquet hall became quite quiet at this time. Hundreds of eyes stared at all this. No one went to stop it, not even Stannis, who was next to the dog. And the dog itself did not turn around and run after achieving its wish. Instead, it fell to the ground and barked a few times, as if it was drunk, and then hugged Stannis and moved under the stunned gaze of many nobles. This situation was so absurd, but also so weird. After the crowd was silent for a moment, unbearable laughter broke the silence in the throne room, and then people made various hilarious noises one after another. The person involved was very calm about this, lowered his head, and observed quietly without moving, and then kicked it away when he did not find any additional changes. Caught off guard, the puppy whimpered and howled as it flew backwards. After landing, it did not give up. Instead, it rolled up with red eyes and approached a drunken red-robed figure who was closer. Whose good puppy are you? Why are you so enthusiastic? The red-robed figure looked down blankly, obviously not seeing what happened before, but his words caused a burst of laughter around him. Several dukes and even the young king began to laugh. However, behind this laughter, a group of doubts always lingered in people's hearts. There was no matchmaking, no external force, and the light in the banquet hall was not strong, but that did not prevent people from seeing the truth. A chicken leg that can move and avoid obstacles. It seems to be cooked. This is the first time in everyone's memory. You are so popular with dogs, I will call you a son of a bitchsaurus from now on. Ha ha ha. The young king laughed casually, but his brows were unconsciously frowned, and someone beside him smiled and agreed. The gods must have been impatient and sent this dog to urge our king to end the banquet. It was unknown whether this was a joke or a self-consolation. Anyway, the banquet continued, but many people became absent-minded. Not long after, the dog was hurriedly picked up by a free family member in the Riverlands. It was obviously a pet of one of their family members. But few people noticed that, after kicking the dog away, Stannis bent down and picked up something that was still moving under his feet. After thinking for a moment, he handed it to the horrified Grand Maester Pycelle. There are many awkward paragraphs in this chapter. Everyone should make do with it. Gideon can't even write about a dog in heat now. It has been changed to pieces. Chapter 124 Customs and Consequences. After the chaos, the wedding banquet continued, but the focus of people's discussion was no longer on the wedding itself. Surprise, contemplation, fear, curiosity. Some people who pretended to know something began to spread all kinds of unreliable explanations in a mysterious way, while some people who really knew something were quite low-key and silent. At this time, the people at the banquet were restless. Even the king himself whispered to Grand Maester Pycelle about what the moving thing was, not to mention others. People generally believed that there were witches, or some mysterious people such as wizards and magicians who had disappeared for a long time, but they were not too panicked. After all, this world has dragons and various ghost stories. Many people have encountered some people dressed in sneaky clothes in daily life, but such obvious supernatural phenomena are the first time they have encountered them. Others blamed the ghost of the Red Keep. The rumor that the Red Keep was haunted was first spread when Renly fell into the secret passage. Now it was brought up again, and in the face of evidence, many people were more convinced of it. In short, a good wedding dinner seemed to have suddenly turned into a discussion about mysterious events, and even the atmosphere of the subsequent dancing session was not enthusiastic at all. The red-robed monk Thoros, who was hugged by the dog, became the focus of the banquet without knowing it, and the drunken party was quite confused about it. However, when the wedding dinner reached the last stage, people still unconsciously put their attention back to the wedding itself, or the most expected part of the wedding, the bridal chamber. In Westeros, the last stage of the wedding is very barbaric. The newlyweds will be stripped naked by the onlookers at this stage, and then escorted into the bridal chamber. This is a stage that people like to see, and it is also a stage where many sneaky people can take advantage of it openly. Renly thought this custom was even a little disgusting. The crowd stripped the newlyweds naked and told dirty jokes, which made his eyelids jump. If anyone dared to do this, when I got married, I would chop off their hands. Renly said this to Tyrion, watching the two newlyweds who were stripped of their clothes and walked further and further away in the crowd. This made the blonde boy, who was watching excitedly, glance at him strangely. Are you engaged, Renly? No. Renly blinked and answered. The other party heard it and said oh, feeling that this person's idea was a little incomprehensible. Not only Tyrion, but even the people around him looked at him strangely after hearing this, thinking that this was very strange. Obviously, what Renly thought was unreasonable had long been taken for granted by others. Even the parties involved did not seem to care much. The naked Robert could even tease the women around him while they laughed, and he did not care that his wife was taken advantage of by men. The newlywed queen, who had always behaved elegantly and gracefully, seemed to be able to handle it as usual. She seemed to be slightly disgusted, but she did not express any dissatisfaction. Shaking his head, Renly simply retracted his gaze and stopped looking at it. Instead, he called his companions to walk out of the corridor and come to an open-air courtyard to get some fresh air. The moonlight was cold, but the atmosphere around was very warm. At this moment, the new lights had been sent to the room. The lively day was basically over. When they woke up tomorrow morning, the Baratheon dynasty would welcome a brand new hostess. If it weren't for the memory of the previous life, this hostess was actually not bad in Renly's impression. She had a kind attitude, a normal personality, and often gave him various small gifts to show her care. Unfortunately, she was a Baratheon. Thinking of this, Renly suddenly saw another person in the shadow in the corner of the courtyard. Now the person was looking at the direction where the crowd disappeared expressionlessly without saying a word. Jaime, why didn't you go with them? The boy next to Renly also saw him, and ran up to him and asked curiously. The other party frowned when he heard it, then smiled casually and said, "It's hot and stuffy with so many people around. Let's get some cool air here." This sentence seemed to have exhausted his patience. Seeing Renly beside him, he bowed to him as a greeting, then turned around and left. He looks a little strange today. Looking at his brother's back, Tyrion, who was not very mature, wondered. He used to love to join in the fun. People change. Renly shrugged and replied, "My girlfriend is getting married, but the groom is not me. No one would feel good about this. But thinking about it this way, who is the one who cheated on whom among these three people?" Tyrion obviously couldn't imagine what kind of bad idea was in the mind of his black-haired companion. Sitting on the railing at the edge of the courtyard, he listened to the noise outside and said thoughtfully, "The dog ate the chicken leg." Renly nodded and said nothing. "I heard that it was the pet of a girl from the Free family and the twins. I saw their knights find the dog back," Tyrion said, and suddenly winked at Renly. The Red Monk was reluctant to leave. "I hope he will still be reluctant after he sobers up." Renly touched his chin. "It's a pity that it was eaten by the dog," Tyrion said sadly. "Such an interesting thing. It's gone just like that. If only it was gone like that." Renly thought secretly. He felt that it was a bit abnormal for the dog to suddenly go into heat after eating the chicken leg, but he couldn't say how abnormal it was. After all, he was also at a loss about the chicken leg. "I hope nothing unexpected will happen." He looked down at his left wrist, and the special pattern made him frown unconsciously. On the way back to the bachelor's room, Grand Maester Pycelle was very nervous, because the iron can in his arms was constantly shaking. The noise behind him was getting farther and farther away with his footsteps, and he didn't catch up with the long-awaited bridal chamber. The old man with grey beard couldn't help but complain about why Stannis gave him this scalp-numbing thing, so that he had to leave in a hurry with the can before the wedding was over. That's fine. Doesn't he know that as a weathered old man, he can't stand being frightened at all? It would be better to send 2 soldiers. Feeling the shaking iron can in his arms, the old man walked timidly on the quiet road of the Red Castle, and couldn't help but let his mind wander. Magic doesn't exist. This must be something we don't understand yet. Yes, it must be like this, he muttered, as if he was treating it as a life-saving spell. However, just as the old man finished speaking, he suddenly felt that the iron can in his arm stopped moving. His heart skipped a beat and the old man felt something was wrong, but he cautiously did not open the can. Instead, he still held it and walked towards his destination. He was ready to write a letter to Old Town as soon as he arrived, reporting what happened to the Cardinal today, and then send this thing to the Citadel as soon as he arrived. He didn't have the slightest curiosity to find out, and he didn't want to open the can at all. The Citadel will always find out. Thinking of this, the old man felt relieved. At this time, a maid was walking by with a fluffy khaki pet dog. When she saw Grand Maester Pycelle, she stopped to salute and greeted him. Seeing this, the old man also politely returned the greeting and glanced at him. It's just that his focus was always on the figure of the opposite sex, but at this time, the attention of this old man in his 60s was all on the maid. For some reason, he suddenly felt that the yellow-haired puppy looked so handsome. Thank you Ouroboros for the 500 UN reward, and thank you Xyanatang 246 and Gufanayu for the 100 UN reward. Chapter 125 The Disappearing Black Cat. When the heavy door creaked shut, all the noise was blocked out. The reflection of the candlelight flickered on the green carpet, and the unique smell of candle oil drifted into his nostrils. The boy, who had finished a busy day, breathed a sigh of relief at the door, and then suddenly murmured, May the warrior grant me courage. After waiting for a while, there was no response. He walked towards the bed without caring, and then collapsed on it. Robert's wedding was over, and Renly was basically liberated. In the next 2 days, he planned to carefully study the new abilities he had at this time. The Psychic Heart, the Warrior's Son, and the Chaos Mark. Compared with the past, these 3 abilities are more wonderful than the other. Renly attaches the most importance to, or is most worried about, the Chaos Mark, which is not even recorded in the system information, because it seems to be uncontrollable, and has no beneficial effects except causing chaos. The Warrior's Son ability is probably useful in battle, but it is obviously impossible for him to encounter any battles at this time, and its prayer power does not seem to be so reliable. Apart from the first time Renly said something to Tyrion, he said it 7 or 8 times today, but there was no response. Maybe this blessing is not obvious, or maybe it is useless to say it to himself. The last Psychic Heart seems to be effective, as long as it is a living thing, which means it is not limited to humans. Renly thought about asking the servants to find him a few birds or other pets, to try it out early tomorrow morning, but he didn't have any expectations for it. After all, it is described as hearing the voices of living things, not communicating with them. Simply hearing the voices of cats and dogs is obviously useless to him. Apart from these gains, the knight profession, that took him the longest time to obtain, is also useless at the moment. He is only 5 years old, and there are more than 2 months before his 6th birthday. Thinking of this, the boy frowned unconsciously, thinking that it would be great if he could be reborn like the time travelers in the novels he remembered, and be an adult right away, so there would be no such troubles of growing up, and there would be no need to carefully disguise himself as a child. Life is not satisfactory, 8 out of 10 times. Muttering, a servant brought a bucket of bath water outside, and Renly stopped thinking about it. He took off his clothes and soaked in it. The warm feeling around his body made him breathe a sigh of relief, and then he leaned against the bucket to relax his body and mind, feeling faintly drowsy. Relying on the special blood in his body, he was not afraid of drowning, so occasionally when he took a bath, he would fall into the water and sleep for a while without any worries, and then come out and go back to bed to continue sleeping when the water cooled down. Because of his special quirk, the maids would all avoid him when he took a bath, and no one noticed this special thing about the boy. But this time Renly did not fall asleep, because when he was in a trance in the water, he suddenly saw a reflection on the surface of the bath water that should not exist. The black reflection had a pair of blue eyes, squatting quietly on the edge of the bathtub, with a slender figure, and the shadow was vaguely reflected on the surface of the water and kept rippling. This figure was very familiar, and Renly even looked for it for a long time before. But it was also strange, because in the center of its chest, there was a piece of gold gray mixed with something that looked like scales. Staring at the reflection in the water, he couldn't help but look up at the edge of the empty wooden tub, and then look down at the black cat in the water that seemed to be greeting him with its paws raised. Renly was confused. "Have you become a ghost?" He stretched out his fingers and stirred the bath water. The reflection of the black cat also rippled continuously, and it seemed to hear what Renly was saying. After hearing the words, it tilted its head and seemed a little puzzled. It may not have realized what it looked like now. It opened its mouth and seemed to call a few times, but Renly didn't hear any sound. In a trance, the black-haired boy felt that everything he saw was a bit scary, so he didn't care about taking a bath in the water. He jumped out and put on the satin pajamas prepared by the maid in advance, and then returned to the bathtub and looked down again. The cat had disappeared. This made Renly speechless for a long time. The moving chicken legs, the male dog in heat, the black cat that seemed to have disappeared but could be seen from the water, and the scales that seemed to be full of deja vu. Originally, Renly thought that the cat had run away on its own, but now it seemed that it was not the case. However, since it did not run away, what on earth did it encounter to become like that? And the scales. Thinking of this, the boy could not help but look at his left wrist. The black and white mark made him look dazed. Is it because of this too? There was no answer. His mind was completely a mess. Facing this supernatural situation, Renly felt deeply powerless. Obviously, he could not sleep well that night in this state. So when he had breakfast the next morning, the black-haired boy looked a little wilted. "Renly, look at you looking like you saw a ghost. Did you marry a wife yesterday?" The young king at the head of the table laughed and teased. The blonde woman at the hostess seat opposite also smiled and glanced at the boy, but for some reason, her smile seemed very forced. "I was thinking about the chicken leg," Renly answered, so Robert's smile faded. After a dry cough, he said, "Why do children think so much? There are so many weird people in the world. When I was in the valley, I saw a headless chicken walking back and forth. It was much scarier than last night. I don't know if he was speaking to comfort or if it was really true." Renly said oh, and said no more. He honestly spread butter on the white bread. At this time, in addition to the king and his wife, there was also Stannis at the table, but there was no need for him to never speak. And Cersei, who seemed to have a very lively personality a while ago, seemed to be in a bad mood on the first day of becoming the queen, so the only voice of his majesty was nagging at breakfast. "Lord Tyrell will set out for the Reach in 2 days. You will be with him. Your safety will be guaranteed, so I do not plan to send you guards. However, you must have servants, as well as money." Tyrell said he would cover all your expenses in Highgarden. His family is quite wealthy, but we Baratheons will not take advantage of him. "Make 2 more friends for me when you get there. The Tyrell children are suitable. There are also the Tullys of Hornhill. I heard that the wife of that bastard Randall gave birth to a son not long ago. I have a lot of opinions about him, but it has nothing to do with you. You can go and have a look when you have time. But you can't be as withdrawn as you were at Storm's End. I tell you, this is a mission given to you by the king, so don't take it lightly. By the way, Renly, be more diligent when you get to the Reach. Pycelle said that you have never gone to him to learn anything. This won't do. You should read more at your age. When I was young, I thought I was. He's so nagging." The black cat Balerion thought to himself, curled up at the black-haired boy's feet, and looked up at the face of his little master sitting on the chair. He seemed to be listening attentively, but in fact he seemed impatient. Seeing this, his fluffy tail couldn't help but shake, and he felt a little happy. The black cat hated the man sitting in the first seat. For some reason, he always had the urge to scratch his face, but he heard that he seemed to be his little master's brother, so he kept holding back. Now that he saw that his little master was also annoyed with him, he was really happy in his heart, but after looking at the little boy next to him who seemed very beautiful to him, he felt very sad. Why has the little master ignored me these 2 days? His little heart was full of puzzlement, and even a little depressed. That day, when he saw the little master sleeping soundly on the bed, he bravely jumped on him and slept in his arms for a night. As a result, when he woke up, the little master ignored him. Was he angry? The black cat thought so, and glanced at the boy's legs hanging on the chair beside him with its sparkling blue eyes. It instinctively wanted to rub against him to please him, but then it remembered that its little master was annoyed by its touching him, so it had to meow weakly to attract his attention. Unfortunately, he still ignored it, so the black cat lay its head on its paws in a depressed mood, feeling that it seemed to have fallen out of favor. However, as a smart cat, it thought it must not sit still and wait for death, so after lying down and yawning, it pretended to casually press a hard object under its paws on the ground and rubbed it, hoping that this noise would attract some attention. It was a pocket-sized knight's helmet, which seemed to be the size of its palm. The black cat found it at the banquet yesterday. Last night, a strange pocket knight was chased by a dog and ran around. He screamed and yelled, as if he was so scared, that he didn't even bother to pick up his helmet when it accidentally fell to the ground. So the black cat squatting behind his little master ran up and bit it and brought it back. The cat's thinking made it feel that this was no big deal, but another voice in its heart always made it think that such a small and realistic helmet seemed very precious. So the black cat kept biting it and walked around, treating it as a treasure. However, in order to attract the attention of the little master, it didn't care about whether it was a treasure or not. It turned its claws attentively, hoping that some conscienceless guy would look at it. Its behavior successfully created a lot of noise. The sound of the hard pocket helmet rubbing against the ground was even more obvious than the voice of the annoying guy. Unfortunately, he still ignored it. The black cat increased its strength in dissatisfaction. So this pocket iron helmet just rubbed and rubbed on the ground, and the sound of the checkered marble surface rubbing against the metal was clattering, clattering, clattering. Don't worry, this book will be on the shelves next Friday, if nothing unexpected happens. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.